This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 12. Doomed to Die. For an instant I stood there before they fell upon me, but the first rush of them forced me back a step or two. My foot felt for the floor, but found only empty space. I had backed into the pit which had received Ischus. For a second I toppled there upon the brink. Then I, too, with the boy still tightly clutched in my arms, pitched backward into the black abyss. We struck a polished chute. The opening above us closed as magically as it had opened, and we shot down, unharmed, into a dimly lighted apartment far below the arena. As I rose to my feet, the first thing I saw was the malignant countenance of Ischus glaring at me through the heavy bars of a grated door at one side of the chamber. "Rash mortal," she shrilled, "you shall pay the awful penalty for your blasphemy in this secret cell. Here you shall lie alone and in darkness, with the carcass of your accomplice festering in its rottenness by your side, until crazed by loneliness and hunger you feed upon the crawling maggots that were once a man." That was all. In another instant she was gone, and the dim light which had filled the cell faded into Cimmerian blackness. "Pleasant old lady," said a voice at my side. "Who speaks?" I asked. "'Tis I, your companion, who has had the honor this day of fighting shoulder to shoulder with the greatest warrior that ever wore metal upon Barsoom." "I thank God that you are not dead," I said. "I feared for that nasty cut upon your head." "It but stunned me," he replied. "A mere scratch." "Maybe it were as well had it been final," I said. "We seem to be in a pretty fix here, with a splendid chance of dying of starvation and thirst." "Where are we?" "Beneath the arena," I replied. "We tumbled down the shaft that swallowed Ischus as she was almost at our mercy." He laughed a low laugh of pleasure and relief, and then reaching out through the inky blackness, he sought my shoulder and pulled my ear close to his mouth. "Nothing could be better," he whispered. "There are secrets within the secrets of Ischus, of which Ischus herself does not dream." "What do you mean?" "I labored with the other slaves a year since in the remodeling of these subterranean galleries, and at that time we found below these an ancient system of corridors and chambers that had been sealed up for ages. The blacks in charge of the work explored them, taking several of us along to do whatever work there might be occasion for. I know the entire system perfectly. There are miles of corridors honeycombing the ground beneath the gardens and the temple itself, and there is one passage that leads down to and connects with the lower regions that open on the water shaft that gives passage to Omine. If we can reach the submarine undetected, we may yet make the sea in which there are many islands where the blacks never go. There we may live for a time, and who knows what may transpire to aid us to escape." He had spoken all in a low whisper, evidently fearing spying ears even here, and so I answered him in the same subdued tone. "Lead back to Shador, my friend," I whispered. "Exeter the Black is there. We were to attempt our escape together, so I cannot desert him." "No," said the boy, "one cannot desert a friend. It were better to be recaptured ourselves than that." Then he commenced groping his way about the floor of the dark chamber, searching for the trap that led to the corridors beneath. At length he summoned me by a low "tsk." I crept toward the sound of his voice, to find him kneeling on the brink of an opening in the floor. "There is a drop here of about 10 feet, he whispered. "Hang by your hands, and you will alight safely on a level floor of soft sand." Very quietly I lowered myself from the inky cell above into the inky pit below. So utterly dark was it that we could not see our hands at an inch from our noses. Never, I think, have I known such complete absence of light as existed in the pits of Ischus. For an instant I hung in mid-air. There is a strange sensation connected with an experience of that nature which is quite difficult to describe. When the feet tread empty air and the distance below is shrouded in darkness, there is a feeling akin to panic at the thought of releasing the hold and taking the plunge into unknown depths. Although the boy had told me that it was but 10 feet to the floor below, I experienced the same thrills as though I were hanging above a bottomless pit. Then I released my hold and dropped 4 feet to a soft cushion of sand. The boy followed me. "Raise me to your shoulders," he said, "and I will replace the trap." This done, he took me by the hand, leading me very slowly with much feeling about and frequent halts to assure himself that he did not stray into wrong passageways. Presently we commenced the descent of a very steep incline. "It will not be long," he said, "before we shall have light. At the lower levels we meet the same strata of phosphorescent rock that illuminates Omine." Never shall I forget that trip through the pits of Ischus. While it was devoid of important incidents, yet it was filled for me with a strange charm of excitement and adventure, which I think I must have hinged principally on the unguessable antiquity of these long-forgotten corridors. The things which the Stygian darkness hid from my objective eye could not have been half so wonderful as the pictures which my imagination wrought as it conjured to life again the ancient peoples of this dying world and set them once more to the labors, the intrigues, the mysteries, and the cruelties which they had practiced to make their last stand against the swarming hordes of the Dead Sea bottoms that had driven them step by step to the uttermost pinnacle of the world, where they were now entrenched behind an impenetrable barrier of superstition. In addition to the green men, there had been 3 principal races upon Barsoom: the blacks, the whites, and a race of yellow men. As the waters of the planet dried and the seas receded, all other resources dwindled until life upon the planet became a constant battle for survival. The various races had made war upon one another for ages, and the 3 higher types had easily bested the green savages of the water places of the world. But now that the receding seas necessitated constant abandonment of their fortified cities and forced upon them a more or less nomadic life, in which they became separated into smaller communities, they soon fell prey to the fierce hordes of green men. The result was a partial amalgamation of the blacks, whites, and yellows, the result of which is shown in the present splendid race of red men. I had always supposed that all traces of the original races had disappeared from the face of Mars, yet within the past 4 days I had found both whites and blacks in great multitudes. Could it be possible that in some far-off corner of the planet there still existed a remnant of the ancient race of yellow men? My reveries were broken in upon by a low exclamation from the boy. "At last the lighted way!" he cried, and looking up I beheld at a long distance before us a dim radiance. As we advanced the light increased until presently we emerged into well-lighted passageways. From then on our progress was rapid, until we came suddenly to the end of a corridor that let directly upon the ledge surrounding the pool of the submarine. The craft lay at her moorings with uncovered hatch. Raising his finger to his lips, and then tapping his sword in a significant manner, the youth crept noiselessly toward the vessel. I was close at his heels. Silently we dropped to the deserted deck, and on hands and knees crawled toward the hatchway. A stealthy glance below revealed no guard in sight, and so with the quickness and the soundlessness of cats we dropped together into the main cabin of the submarine. Even here was no sign of life. Quickly we covered and secured the hatch. Then the boy stepped into the pilot-house, touched a button, and the boat sank amid swirling waters toward the bottom of the shaft. Even then there was no scurrying of feet as we had expected, and while the boy remained to direct the boat, I slid from cabin to cabin in futile search for some member of the crew. The craft was entirely deserted. Such good fortune seemed almost unbelievable. When I returned to the pilot-house to report the good news to my companion, he handed me a paper. "This may explain the absence of the crew," he said. It was a radio-aerial message to the commander of the submarine. "The slaves have risen. Come with what men you have and those that you can gather on the way. Too late to get aid from Omine. They are massacring all within the amphitheater. Ischus is threatened. Haste. Zithad." "Zithad is a detour of the guards of Ischus," explained the youth. "We gave them a bad scare, one that they will not soon forget." "Let us hope that it is but the beginning of the end of Ischus," I said. "Only our first ancestor knows," he replied. We reached the submarine pool in Omine without incident. Here we debated the wisdom of sinking the craft before leaving her, but finally decided that it would add nothing to our chances for escape. There were plenty of blacks on Omin to thwart us were we apprehended. However many more might come from the temples and gardens of Ishus would not in any way decrease our chances. We were now in a quandary as to how to pass the guards who patrolled the island about the pool. At last I hit upon a plan. "What is the name or the title of the officer in charge of these guards?" I asked the boy. "A fellow named Torith was on duty when we entered this morning," he replied. "Good. And what is the name of the commander of the submarine?" "Yerstead." I found a dispatch blank in the cabin and wrote the following order: "De Torth, return these 2 slaves at once to Shador. Yerstead." "That will be the simpler way to return," I said, smiling, as I handed the forged order to the boy. "Come, we shall see now how well it works." "But our swords!" he exclaimed. "What shall we say to explain them?" "Since we cannot explain them, we shall have to leave them behind us," I replied. "Is it not the extreme of rashness to thus put ourselves again unarmed in the power of the firstborn?" "It is the only way," I answered. "You may trust me to find a way out of the prison of Shador, and I think, once out, that we shall find no great difficulty in arming ourselves once more in a country which abounds so plentifully in armed men." "As you say," he replied with a smile and a shrug. "I could not follow another leader who inspired greater confidence than you. Come, let us put your ruse to the test." Boldly we emerged from the hatchway of the craft, leaving our swords behind us, and strode to the main exit which led to the sentry's post and the office of the detour of the guard. At sight of us the members of the guard sprang forward in surprise, and with levelled rifles halted us. I held out the message to one of them. He took it, and seeing to whom it was addressed, turned and handed it to Torith, who was emerging from his office to learn the cause of the commotion. The black read the order, and for a moment eyed us with evident suspicion. "Where's Detour Yerstead?" he asked, and my heart sank within me, as I cursed myself for a stupid fool in not having sunk the submarine to make good the lie that I must tell. "His orders were to return immediately to the temple landing," I replied. Torith took a half-step toward the entrance to the pool as though to corroborate my story. For that instant everything hung in the balance. For had he done so, and found the empty submarine still lying at her wharf, the whole weak fabric of my concoction would have tumbled about our heads. But evidently he decided the message must be genuine, nor indeed was there any good reason to doubt it, since it would scarce have seemed credible to him that 2 slaves would voluntarily have given themselves into custody in any such manner as this. It was the very boldness of the plan which rendered it successful. "Were you connected with the rising of the slaves?" asked Torith. "We have just had meagre reports of some such event." "All were involved," I replied, "but it amounted to little. The guards quickly overcame and killed the majority of us." He seemed satisfied with this reply. "Take them to Shador," he ordered, turning to one of his subordinates. We entered a small boat lying beside the island, and in a few minutes were disembarking upon Shador. Here we were returned to our respective cells, I with Edgar, the boy by himself, and behind locked doors we were again prisoners of the firstborn. End of chapter 12.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the South Shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 13. A Break for Liberty. Edgar listened in incredulous astonishment to my narration of the events which had transpired within the arena at the rites of Ishus. He could scarce conceive, even though he had already professed his doubt as to the deity of Ishus, that one could threaten her with a sword in hand and not be blasted into 1,000 fragments by the mere fury of her divine wrath. "It is the final proof," he said at last. "No more is needed to completely shatter the last remnant of my superstitious belief in the divinity of Ishus. She is only a wicked old woman, wielding a mighty power for evil through machination, that have kept her own people in all Barsoom in religious ignorance for ages." "She is still all-powerful here, however," I replied, "so it behooves us to leave at the first moment that appears at all propitious." "I hope that you may find a propitious moment," he said with a laugh, for it is certain that in all my life I have never seen one in which a prisoner of the firstborn might escape." "Tonight will do as well as any," I replied. "It will soon be night," said Exeter. "How may I aid in the adventure?" "Can you swim?" I asked him. "No slimy Scythian that haunts the depths of Chorus is more at home in water than is Exeter," he replied. "Good. The Red One in all probability cannot swim," I said, "since there is scarce enough water in all their domains to float the tiniest craft. One of us, therefore, will have to support him through the sea to the craft we select. I had hoped that we might make the entire distance below the surface, but I feared that the Red Youth could not thus perform the trip. Even the bravest of the brave among them are terrorized at the mere thought of deep water, for it has been ages since their forebears saw a lake, a river, or a sea." "The Red One is to accompany us?" asked Exeter. "Yes." "It is well. 3 swords are better than 2, especially when the third is as mighty as this fellow's. I have seen him battle in the arena at the rites of Isis many times. Never, until I saw you fight, had I seen one who seemed unconquerable even in the face of great odds. One might think you two master and pupil, or father and son. Come to recall his face, there is a resemblance between you. It is very marked when you fight. There is the same grim smile, the same maddening contempt for your adversary apparent in every movement of your bodies and in every changing expression of your faces. Be that as it may, Exeter, he is a great fighter. I think that we will make a trio difficult to overcome, and if my friend Tars Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, were but one of us, we could fight our way from one end of Barsoom to the other, even though the whole world were pitted against us." "It will be," said Exeter, "when they find from whence you have come. That is but one of the superstitions which Isis has foisted upon a credulous humanity. She works through the holy Therns, who are as ignorant of her real self as are the Barsoomians of the outer world. Her decrees are borne to the Therns, written in blood upon a strange parchment. The poor deluded fools think that they are receiving the revelations of a goddess through some supernatural agency, since they find these messages upon their guarded altars, to which none could have access without detection. I myself have borne these messages for Isis for many years. There is a long tunnel from the temple of Isis to the principal temple of Matai Shang. It was dug ages ago by the slaves of the firstborn in such utter secrecy that no Thern ever guessed its existence. The Therns, for their part, have temples dotted about the entire civilized world. Here priests whom the people never see communicate the doctrine of the mysterious river Ish, the valley Dor, and the lost sea of Chorus to persuade the poor deluded creatures to take the voluntary pilgrimage that swells the wealth of the holy Therns and adds to the number of their slaves. Thus the Therns are used as the principal means for collecting the wealth and labor that the firstborn wrest from them as they need it. Occasionally the firstborn themselves make raids upon the outer world. It is then that they capture many females of the royal houses of the Red Men, and take the newest in battleships and the trained artisans who build them, that they may copy what they cannot create. We are a non-productive race, priding ourselves upon our non-productiveness. It is criminal for a firstborn to labor or invent. That is the work of the lower orders, who live merely that the firstborn may enjoy long lives of luxury and idleness. With us, fighting is all that counts. Were it not for that, there would be more of the firstborn than all the creatures of Barsoom could support. For in so far as I know, none of us ever dies a natural death. Our females would live forever but for the fact that we tire of them and remove them to make place for others. Isis alone of all is protected against death. She has lived for countless ages. Would not the other Barsoomians live forever, but for the doctrine of the voluntary pilgrimage, which drags them to the bosom of Ish, at or before their 1000th year? I asked him. I feel now that there is no doubt but that they are precisely the same species of creature as the firstborn, and I hope that I shall live to fight for them in atonement of the sins I have committed against them through the ignorance born of generations of false teaching. As he ceased speaking, a weird call rang out across the waters of Omin. I had heard it at the same time the previous evening, and knew that it marked the ending of the day, when the men of Omin spread their silks upon the deck of battleship and cruiser, and fall into the dreamless sleep of Mars. Our guard entered to inspect us for the last time before the new day broke upon the world above. His duty was soon performed, and the heavy door of our prison closed behind him. We were alone for the night. I gave him time to return to his quarters, as Exeter said he probably would do. Then I sprang to the grated window and surveyed the nearby waters. At a little distance from the island, a quarter of a mile perhaps, lay a monster battleship, while between her and the shore were a number of smaller cruisers and one-man scouts. Upon the battleship alone was there a watch. I could see him plainly in the upper works of the ship, and as I watched I saw him spread his sleeping silks upon the tiny platform in which he was stationed. Soon he threw himself at full length upon his couch. The discipline on Omin was lax indeed, but it is not to be wondered at, since no enemy guessed the existence upon Barsoom of such a fleet, or even of the firstborn, or the Sea of Omin. Why indeed should they maintain a watch? Presently I dropped to the floor again and talked with Exeter, describing the various craft I had seen. "There is one there," he said, "my personal property, built to carry 5 men. That is the swiftest of the swift. If we can board her, we can at least make a memorable run for liberty." And then he went on to describe to me the equipment of the boat, her engines, and all that went to make her the flyer that she was. In his explanation I recognized a trick of gearing that Cantos Can had taught me that time we sailed under false names in the navy of Zodanga beneath Sabthan the prince, and I knew then that the firstborn had stolen it from the ships of Helium, for only they are thus geared. And I knew too that Exeter spoke the truth when he lauded the speed of his little craft, for nothing that cleaves the thin air of Mars can approximate the speed of the ships of Helium. We decided to wait for an hour, at least until all the stragglers had sought their silks. In the meantime I was to fetch the red youth to our cell, so that we would be in readiness to make our rash break for freedom together. I sprang to the top of our partition wall and pulled myself up onto it. There I found a flat surface about a foot in width, and along this I walked until I came to the cell in which I saw the boy sitting upon his bench. He had been leaning back against the wall looking up at the glowing dome above Omin, and when he spied me balancing upon the partition wall above him, his eyes opened wide in astonishment. Then a wide grin of appreciative understanding spread across his countenance. As I stooped to drop to the floor beside him, he motioned me to wait, and coming close below me, whispered, "Catch my hand. I can almost leap to the top of that wall myself. I have tried it many times, and each day I come a little closer. Some day I should have been able to make it." I lay upon my belly across the wall and reached my hand far down toward him. With a little run from the center of the cell, he sprang up until I grasped his outstretched hand, and thus I pulled him to the wall's top beside me. "You are the first jumper I ever saw among the red men of Barsoom," I said. He smiled. "It is not strange. I will tell you why when we have more time." Together we returned to the cell in which Exeter sat, descending to talk with him until the hour had passed. There we made our plans for the immediate future, binding ourselves by a solemn oath to fight to the death for one another against whatsoever enemy should confront us, for we knew that even should we succeed in escaping the firstborn, we might still have a whole world against us. The power of religious superstition is mighty. It was agreed that I should navigate the craft after we had reached her, and that if we made the outer world in safety, we should attempt to reach Helium without a stop. "Why Helium?" asked the red youth. "I am a prince of Helium," I replied. He gave me a peculiar look, but said nothing further on the subject. I wondered at the time what the significance of his expression might be, but in the press of other matters it soon left my mind, nor did I have occasion to think of it again until later. "Come," I said at length, "now is as good a time as any. Let us go." Another moment found me at the top of the partition wall again with the boy beside me. Unbuckling my harness, I snapped it together with a single long strap, which I lowered to the waiting Exeter below. He grasped the end and was soon sitting beside us. "How simple!" he laughed. "The balance should be even simpler," I replied. Then I raised myself to the top of the outer wall of the prison, just so that I could peer over and locate the passing sentry. For a matter of 5 minutes I waited, and then he came in sight on his slow and snail-like beat about the structure. I watched him until he made the turn at the end of the building, which carried him out of sight of the side of the prison that was to witness our dash for freedom. The moment his form disappeared, I grasped Exeter and drew him to the top of the wall. Placing one end of my harness strap in his hands, I lowered him quickly to the ground below. Then the boy grasped the strap and slid down to Exeter's side. In accordance with our arrangement, they did not wait for me, but walked slowly toward the water, a matter of 100 yards, directly past the guardhouse filled with sleeping soldiers. They had taken scarce a dozen steps when I too dropped to the ground and followed them leisurely toward the shore. As I passed the guardhouse, the thought of all the good blades lying there gave me pause, for if ever men were to have need of swords, it was my companions and I on the perilous trip upon which we were about to embark. I glanced towards Edgar and the youth, and saw that they had slipped over the edge of the dock into the water. In accordance with our plan, they were to remain there clinging to the metal rings which studded the concrete-like substance of the dock at the water's level, with only their mouths and noses above the surface of the sea until I should join them. The lure of the swords within the guardhouse was strong upon me, and I hesitated a moment, half inclined to risk the attempt to take the few we needed. That he who hesitates is lost proved itself a true aphorism in this instant, for another moment saw me creeping stealthily toward the door of the guardhouse. Gently I pressed it open a crack, enough to discover a dozen blacks stretched upon their silks in profound slumber. At the far side of the room a rack held the swords and firearms of the men. Wearily I pushed the door a trifle wider to admit my body. A hinge gave out a resentful groan. One of the men stirred, and my heart stood still. I cursed myself for a fool to have thus jeopardized our chances for escape, but there was nothing for it now but to see the adventure through. With a spring as swift and as noiseless as a tiger's, I lit beside the guardsman who had moved. My hands hovered about his throat, awaiting the moment that his eyes should open. For what seemed an eternity to my overwrought nerves, I remained poised thus. Then the fellow turned again upon his side and resumed the even respiration of deep slumber. Carefully I picked my way between and over the soldiers until I had gained the rack at the far side of the room. Here I turned to survey the sleeping men. All were quiet. Their regular breathing rose and fell in a soothing rhythm that seemed to me the sweetest music I ever had heard. Gingerly I drew a long sword from the rack. The scraping of the scabbard against its holder as I withdrew it sounded like the filing of a cast iron with a great rasp, and I looked to see the room immediately filled with alarmed and attacking guardsmen, but none stirred. The second sword I withdrew noiselessly, but the third clanked in its scabbard with a frightful din. I knew that it must awaken some of the men at least, and was on the point of forestalling their attack by a rapid charge for the doorway, when again, to my intense surprise, not a black moved. Either they were wondrous heavy sleepers, or else the noises that I made were really much less than they seemed to me. I was about to leave the rack when my attention was attracted by the revolvers. I knew that I could not carry more than one away with me, for I was already too heavily laden to move quietly with any degree of safety or speed. As I took one of them from its pin, my eye fell for the first time on an open window beside the rack. Ah, here was a splendid means of escape, for it let directly upon the dock, not 20 feet from the water's edge. And as I congratulated myself, I heard the door opposite me open, and there, looking me full in the face, stood the officer of the guard. He evidently took in the situation at a glance and appreciated the gravity of it as quickly as I, for our revolvers came up simultaneously, and the sounds of the two reports were as one as we touched the buttons on the grips that exploded the cartridges. I felt the wind of his bullet as it whizzed past my ear, and at the same instant I saw him crumple to the ground. Where I hit him I do not know, nor if I killed him, for scarce had he started to collapse when I was through the window at my rear. In another second the waters of Omine closed above my head, and the three of us were making for the little flyer 100 yards away. Edgar was burdened with the boy, and I with the 3 long swords. The revolver I had dropped, so that while we were both strong swimmers, it seemed to me that we moved at a snail's pace through the water. I was swimming entirely beneath the surface, but Edgar was compelled to rise often to let the youth breathe, so it was a wonder that we were not discovered long before we were. In fact, we reached the boat's side and were all aboard before the watch upon the battleship, aroused by the shots, detected us. Then an alarm gun bellowed from a ship's bow, its deep boom reverberating in deafening tones beneath the rocky dome of Omine. Instantly the sleeping thousands were awake. The decks of 1,000 monster craft teemed with fighting men, for an alarm on Omine was a thing of rare occurrence. We cast away before the sound of the first gun had died, and another second saw us rising swiftly from the surface of the sea. I lay at full length along the deck with the levers and the buttons of control before me. Edgar and the boy were stretched directly behind me, prone also that we might offer as little resistance to the air as possible. "Rise high," whispered Edgar. They dare not fire their heavy guns toward the dome. The fragments of the shells would drop back among their own craft. If we are high enough, our keel plates will protect us from rifle fire." I did as he bade. Below us we could see the men leaping into the water by hundreds, and striking out for the small cruisers and the one-man flyers that lay moored about the big ships. The larger craft were getting under way, following us rapidly, but not rising from the water. "A little to your right," cried Exeter, for there are no points of compass upon Omine where every direction is due north. The pandemonium that had broken out below us was deafening. Rifles cracked, officers shouted orders, men yelled directions to one another from the water and from the decks of the myriad boats, while through all ran the purr of countless propellers cutting water and air. I had not dared pull my speed lever to the highest, for fear of overrunning the mouth of the shaft that passed from Omine's dome to the world above, but even so we were hitting a clip that I doubt has ever been equaled on the windless sea. The smaller flyers were commencing to rise toward us when Exeter shouted, "The shaft! The shaft! Dead ahead!" and I saw the opening black and yawning in the glowing dome of this underworld. A 10-man cruiser was rising directly in front to cut off our escape. It was the only vessel that stood in our way, but at the rate that it was traveling it would come between us and the shaft in plenty of time to thwart our plans. It was rising at an angle of about 45 degrees dead ahead of us, with the evident intention of combing us with grappling hooks from above as it skimmed low over our deck. There was but one forlorn hope for us, and I took it. It was useless to try to pass over her, for that would have allowed her to force us against the rocky dome above, and we were already too near that as it was. To have attempted to dive below her would have put us entirely at her mercy, and precisely where she wanted us. On either side 100 other menacing craft were hastening toward us. The alternative was filled with risk. In fact, it was all risk, with but a slender chance of success. As we neared the cruiser I rose as though to pass above her, so that she would do just what she did do, rise at a steeper angle to force me still higher. Then as we were almost upon her I yelled to my companions to hold tight, and throwing the little vessel into her highest speed I deflected her bows at the same instant until we were running horizontally and at a terrific velocity straight for the cruiser's keel. Her commander may have seen my intentions then, but it was too late. Almost at the instant of impact I turned my bows upward, and then with a shattering jolt we were in collision. What I had hoped for happened. The cruiser, already tilted at a perilous angle, was carried completely over backward by the impact of my smaller vessel. Her crew fell twisting and screaming through the air to the water far below, while the cruiser, her propellers still madly churning, dived swiftly head foremost after them to the bottom of the Sea of Omine. The collision crushed our steel bows, and notwithstanding every effort on our part came near to hurtling us from the deck. As it was, we landed in a wildly clutching heap at the very extremity of the flyer, where Exeter and I succeeded in grasping the handrail. But the boy would have plunged overboard had I not fortunately grasped his ankle, as he was already partially over. Unguided, our vessel careened wildly in its mad flight, rising ever nearer the rocks above. It took but an instant, however, for me to regain the levers, and with the roof barely 50 feet above, I turned her nose once more into the horizontal plane and headed her again for the black mouth of the shaft. The collision had retarded our progress, and now 100 swift scouts were close upon us. Exeter had told me that ascending the shaft by virtue of our repulsive rays alone would give our enemies their best chance to overtake us, since our propellers would be idle and in rising we would be outclassed by many of our pursuers. The swifter craft are seldom equipped with large buoyancy tanks, since the added bulk of them tends to reduce a vessel's speed. As many boats were now quite close to us, it was inevitable that we would be quickly overhauled in the shaft, and captured or killed in short order. To me there always seems a way to gain the opposite side of an obstacle. If one cannot pass over it, or below it, or around it, why then there is but a single alternative left, and that is to pass through it. I could not get around the fact that many of these other boats could rise faster than ours by the fact of their greater buoyancy, but I was none the less determined to reach the outer world far in advance of them, or die death of my own choosing in event of failure. "Reverse!" screamed Exeter behind me. "For the love of your first ancestor, reverse! We are at the shaft!" "Hold tight!" I screamed in reply. "Grasp the boy and hold tight! We are going straight up the shaft!" The words were scarce out of my mouth as we swept beneath the pitch-black opening. I threw the bow hard up, dragged the speed lever to its last notch, and clutching a stanchion with one hand and the steering wheel with the other, hung on like grim death and consigned my soul to its author. I heard a little exclamation of surprise from Edgar, followed by a grim laugh. The boy laughed too, and said something which I could not catch for the whistling of the wind of our awful speed. I looked above my head, hoping to catch the gleam of stars by which I could direct our course and hold the hurtling thing that bore us true to the center of the shaft. To have touched the side at the speed we were making would doubtless have resulted in instant death for us all, but not a star showed above, only utter and impenetrable darkness. Then I glanced below me, and there I saw a rapidly diminishing circle of light, the mouth of the opening above the phosphorescent radiance of Omim. By this I steered, endeavoring to keep the circle of light below me ever perfect. At best it was but a slender cord that held us from destruction, and I think that I steered that night more by intuition and blind faith than by skill or reason. We were not long in the shaft, and possibly the very fact of our enormous speed saved us, for evidently we started in the right direction, and so quickly were we out again that we had no time to alter our course. Omim lies perhaps 2 miles below the surface crust of Mars. Our speed must have approximated 200 miles an hour, for Martian flyers are swift, so that at most we were in the shaft not over 40 seconds. We must have been out of it for some seconds before I realized that we had accomplished the impossible. Black darkness enshrouded all about us. There were neither moons nor stars. Never before had I seen such a thing upon Mars, and for the moment I was nonplussed. Then the explanation came to me. It was summer at the South Pole. The ice cap was melting, and those meteoric phenomena, clouds unknown upon the greater part of Barsoom, were shutting out the light of heaven from this portion of the planet. Fortunate indeed it was for us, nor did it take me long to grasp the opportunity for escape which this happy condition offered us. Keeping the boat's nose at a stiff angle, I raced her for the impenetrable curtain which nature had hung above this dying world to shut us out from the sight of our pursuing enemies. We plunged through the cold camp fog without diminishing our speed, and in a moment emerged into the glorious light of the 2 moons and the 1,000,000 stars. I dropped into a horizontal course and headed due north. Our enemies were a good half hour behind us, with no conception of our direction. We had performed the miraculous, and come through 1,000 dangers unscathed. We had escaped from the land of the firstborn. No other prisoners in all the ages of Barsoom had done this thing, and now as I look back upon it, it did not seem to have been so difficult after all. I said as much to Edgar over my shoulder. "It is very wonderful, nevertheless," he replied. "No one else could have accomplished it but John Carter." At the sound of that name the boy jumped to his feet. "John Carter!" he cried. "John Carter! Why, man, John Carter, Prince of Helium, has been dead for years. I am his son!"
End of chapter 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the South Shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 14. The Eyes in the Dark. My son! I could not believe my ears. Slowly I rose and faced the handsome youth. Now that I looked at him closely, I commenced to see why his face and personality had attracted me so strongly. There was much of his mother's incomparable beauty in his clear-cut features, but it was strongly masculine beauty, and his gray eyes and the expression of them were mine. The boy stood facing me, half hope and half uncertainty in his look. "Tell me of your mother," I said. "Tell me all you can of the years that I have been robbed by a relentless fate of her dear companionship." With a cry of pleasure he sprang toward me and threw his arms about my neck, and for a brief moment, as I held my boy close to me, the tears welled to my eyes, and I was like to have choked after the manner of some maudlin fool. But I do not regret it, nor am I ashamed. A long life has taught me that a man may seem weak where women and children are concerned, and yet be anything but a weakling in the sterner avenues of life. "Your stature, your manner, the terrible ferocity of your swordsmanship," said the boy, "are as my mother has described them to me 1,000 times. but even with such evidence I could scarce credit the truth of what seemed so improbable to me. However much I desired it to be true, do you know what thing it was that convinced me more than all the others? What, my boy? I asked. Your first words to me. They were of my mother. None else but the man who loved her as she has told me my father did would have thought first of her. For long years, my son, I can scarce recall a moment that the radiant vision of your mother's face has not been ever before me. Tell me of her. Those who have known her longest say that she has not changed, unless it be to grow more beautiful, were that possible. Only, when she thinks I am not about to see her, her face grows very sad, and oh so wistful. She thinks ever of you, my father, and all Helium mourns with her and for her. Her grandfather's people love her. They loved you also, and fairly worship your memory as the Saviour of Barsoom. Each year that brings its anniversary of the day that saw you racing across a near-dead world to unlock the secret of that awful portal behind which lay the mighty power of life for countless millions, a great festival is held in your honor. But there are tears mingled with thanksgiving, tears of real regret that the author of the happiness is not with them to share the joy of living he died to give them. Upon all Barsoom there is no greater name than John Carter. And by what name has your mother called you, my boy? I asked. The people of Helium asked that I be named with my father's name, but my mother said no, that you and she had chosen a name for me together, and that your wish must be honored before all others. So the name that she called me is the one that you desired, a combination of hers and yours, Carthoris. Exeter had been at the wheel as I talked with my son, and now he called me. She is dropping badly by the head, John Carter, he said. So long as we were rising at a stiff angle it was not noticeable, but now that I am trying to keep a horizontal course it is different. The wound in her bow has opened one of her forward ray tanks. It was true, and after I had examined the damage I found it a much graver matter than I had anticipated. Not only was the forced angle at which we were compelled to maintain the bow in order to keep a horizontal course greatly impeding our speed, but at the rate that we were losing our repulsive rays from the forward tanks, it was but a question of an hour or more when we would be floating stern up and helpless. We had slightly reduced our speed with the dawning of a sense of security, but now I took the helm once more and pulled the noble little engine wide open, so that again we raced north at terrific velocity. In the meantime Carthoris and Exeter, with tools in hand, were puttering with the great rent in the bow in a hopeless endeavor to stem the tide of escaping rays. It was still dark when we passed the northern boundary of the ice cap and the area of clouds. Below us lay a typical Martian landscape, rolling ochre sea bottom of long-dead seas, low surrounding hills, with here and there the grim and silent cities of the dead past, great piles of mighty architecture, tenanted only by age-old memories of a once powerful race and by the great white apes of Barsoom. It was becoming more and more difficult to maintain our little vessel in a horizontal position. Lower and lower sagged the bow until it became necessary to stop the engine to prevent our flight terminating in a swift dive to the ground. As the sun rose and the light of a new day swept away the darkness of night, our craft gave a final spasmodic plunge, turned half upon her side, and then, with deck tilting at a sickening angle, swung in a slow circle, her bow dropping further below her stern each moment. To handrail and stanchion we clung, and finally, as we saw the end approaching, snapped the buckles of our harness to the rings at her sides. In another moment the deck reared at an angle of 90 degrees, and we hung in our leather with feet dangling 1,000 yards above the ground. I was swinging quite close to the controlling devices, so I reached out to the lever that directed the rays of repulsion. The boat responded to the touch, and very gently we began to sink toward the ground. It was fully half an hour before we touched. Directly north of us rose a rather lofty range of hills, toward which we decided to make our way. Since they afforded greater opportunity for concealment from the pursuers, we were confident might stumble in this direction. An hour later found us in the time-rounded gullies of the hills, amid the beautiful flowering plants that abound in the arid waste places of Barsoom. There we found numbers of huge milk-giving shrubs, that strange plant which serves in great part as food and drink for the wild hordes of green men. It was indeed a boon to us, for we all were nearly famished. Beneath a cluster of these, which afforded perfect concealment from wandering air scouts, we lay down to sleep, for me the first time in many hours. This was the beginning of my 5th day upon Barsoom since I had found myself suddenly translated from my cottage on the Hudson to Dor, the valley beautiful, the valley hideous. In all this time I had slept but twice, though once the clock round within the storehouse of the Therns. It was mid-afternoon when I was awakened by someone seizing my hand and covering it with kisses. With a start I opened my eyes to look into the beautiful face of Thuvia. "My prince, she cried, in an ecstasy of happiness. "'Tis you whom I had mourned as dead. My ancestors have been good to me. I have not lived in vain." The girl's voice awoke Exeter and Carthoris. The boy gazed upon the woman in surprise, but she did not seem to realize the presence of another than I. She would have thrown her arms about my neck and smothered me with caresses had I not gently but firmly disengaged myself. "Come, Thuvia," I said soothingly. "You are overwrought by the danger and hardships you have passed through. You forget yourself, as you forget that I am the husband of the Princess of Helium." "I forget nothing, my prince," she replied. "You have spoken no word of love to me, nor do I expect that you ever shall. But nothing can prevent me loving you. I would not take the place of Dejathoris. My greatest ambition is to serve you, my prince, for ever as your slave. No greater boon could I ask, no greater honor could I crave, no greater happiness could I hope." As I've before said, I am no ladies' man, and I must admit that I seldom have felt so uncomfortable and embarrassed as I did that moment. While I was quite familiar with the Martian custom which allows female slaves to Martian men, whose high and chivalrous honor is always ample protection for every woman in his household, yet I had never myself chosen other than men as my body servants. "And I ever return to Helium, Thuvia," I said, "you shall go with me, but as an honored equal and not as a slave. There you shall find plenty of handsome young nobles who would face Isis herself to win a smile from you, and we shall have you married in short order to one of the best of them. Forget your foolish, gratitude-begotten infatuation, which your innocence has mistaken for love. I like your friendship better, Thuvia." "You are my master. It shall be as you say," she replied simply, but there was a note of sadness in her voice. "How came you here, Thuvia?" I asked, "and where is Tarkas?" "The great Thark, I fear, is dead," she replied sadly. "He was a mighty fighter, but a multitude of green warriors of another horde than his overwhelmed him. The last that I saw of him, they were bearing him, wounded and bleeding, to the deserted city from which they had sallied to attack us." "You are not sure that he is dead, then?" I asked. "And where is the city of which you speak?" "It is just beyond this range of hills. The vessel in which you so nobly resigned a place that we might find escape defied our small skill in navigation, with the result that we drifted aimlessly about for 2 days. Then we decided to abandon the craft and attempt to make our way on foot to the nearest waterway. Yesterday we crossed these hills and came upon the dead city beyond. We had passed within its streets and were walking toward the central portion, when at an intersecting avenue we saw a body of green warriors approaching. Tarkas was in advance, and they saw him, but me they did not see. The Thark sprang back to my side and forced me into an adjacent doorway, where he told me to remain in hiding until I could escape, making my way to Helium if possible. "There will be no escape for me now," he said, "for these be the Warhoon of the south. When they have seen my mettle, it will be to the death." Then he stepped out to meet them. Ah, my prince, such fighting! For an hour they had swarmed about him, until the Warhoon dead formed a hill where he had stood. But at last they overwhelmed him, those behind pushing the foremost upon him until there remained no space to swing his great sword. Then he stumbled and went down, and they rolled over him like a huge wave. When they carried him away toward the heart of the city, he was dead, I think, for I did not see him move. "Before we go farther we must be sure," I said. "I cannot leave Tarkas alive among the Warhoons. Tonight I shall enter the city and make sure." "And I shall go with you," spoke Carthoris. "And I," said Exeter. "Neither one of you shall go," I replied. "It is work that requires stealth and strategy, not force. One man alone may succeed where more would invite disaster. I shall go alone. If I need your help, I will return for you." They did not like it, but both were good soldiers, and it had been agreed that I should command. The sun already was low, so that I did not have long to wait before the sudden darkness of Barsoom engulfed us. With a parting word of instructions to Carthoris and Exeter, in case I should not return, I bade them all farewell and set forth at a rapid dog-trot toward the city. As I emerged from the hills, the nearer moon was winging its wild flight through the heavens, its bright beams turning to burnished silver the barbaric splendor of the ancient metropolis. The city had been built upon the gently rolling foothills that in the dim and distant past had sloped down to meet the sea. It was due to this fact that I had no difficulty in entering the streets unobserved. The green hordes that use these deserted cities seldom occupy more than a few squares about the central plaza, and as they come and go always across the Dead Sea bottoms that the cities face, it is usually a matter of comparative ease to enter from the hillside. Once within the streets, I kept close in the dense shadows of the walls. At intersections I halted a moment to make sure that none was in sight before I sprang quickly to the shadows of the opposite side. Thus I made the journey to the vicinity of the plaza without detection. As I approached the purlieus of the inhabited portion of the city, I was made aware of the proximity of the warriors' quarters by the squealing and grunting of the thorts and the zitidars corralled within the hollow courtyards formed by the buildings surrounding each square. These old familiar sounds that are so distinctive of green Martian life sent a thrill of pleasure surging through me. It was as one might feel on coming home after a long absence. It was amid such sounds that I had first courted the incomparable Dejah Thoris in the age-old marble halls of the dead city of Korad. As I stood in the shadows at the far corner of the first square which housed members of the Horde, I saw warriors emerging from several of the buildings. They all went in the same direction, toward a great building which stood in the center of the plaza. My knowledge of green Martian customs convinced me that this was either the quarters of the principal chieftain or contained the audience chamber wherein the Jeddak met his Jeds and lesser chieftains. In either event, it was evident that something was afoot which might have a bearing on the recent capture of Tars Tarkas. To reach this building, which I now felt it imperative that I do, I must needs traverse the entire length of one square and cross a broad avenue and a portion of the plaza. From the noises of the animals which came from every courtyard about me, I knew that there were many people in the surrounding buildings, probably several communities of the great horde of the Warhoons of the south. To pass undetected among all these people was in itself a difficult task, but if I was to find and rescue the great Thark, I must expect even more formidable obstacles before success could be mine. I had entered the city from the south, and now stood on the corner of the avenue through which I had passed and the first intersecting avenue south of the plaza. The buildings upon the south side of this square did not appear to be inhabited, as I could see no lights, and so I decided to gain the inner courtyard through one of them. Nothing occurred to interrupt my progress through the deserted pile I chose, and I came into the inner court close to the rear walls of the east buildings without detection. Within the court a great herd of thorts and zitidars moved restlessly about, cropping the moss-like ochre vegetation which overgrows practically the entire uncultivated area of Mars. What breeze there was came from the northwest, so there was little danger that the beasts would scent me. Had they, their squealing and grunting would have grown to such a volume as to attract the attention of the warriors within the buildings. Close to the east wall, beneath the overhanging balconies of the second floors, I crept in dense shadows the full length of the courtyard, until I came to the buildings on the north end. These were lighted for about 3 floors up, but above the third floor all was dark. To pass through the lighted rooms was, of course, out of the question, since they swarmed with green Martian men and women. My only path lay through the upper floors, and to gain these it was necessary to scale the face of the wall. The reaching of the balcony of the second floor was a matter of easy accomplishment. An agile leap gave my hands a grasp upon the stone handrail above. In another instant I had drawn myself upon the balcony. Here through the open windows I saw the green folk squatting upon their sleeping silks and furs, grunting an occasional monosyllable which, in connection with their wondrous telepathic powers, is ample for their conversational requirements. As I drew closer to listen to their words, a warrior entered the room from the hall beyond. "Come, Tangama," he cried. "We are to take the Thark before Cab Kadja. Bring another with you." The warrior addressed arose, and beckoning a fellow squatting near, the three turned and left the apartment. If I could but follow them, the chance might come to free Tars Tarkas at once. At least I would learn the location of his prison. At my right was a door leading from the balcony into the building. It was at the end of an unlighted hall, and on the impulse of the moment I stepped within. The hall was broad and led straight through to the front of the building. On either side were the doorways of the various apartments which lined it. I had no more than entered the corridor than I saw the 3 warriors at the other end, those whom I had just seen leaving the apartment. Then a turn to the right took them from my sight again. Quickly I hastened along the hallway in pursuit. My gait was reckless, but I felt that fate had been kind indeed to throw such an opportunity within my grasp, and I could not afford to allow it to elude me now. At the far end of the corridor I found a spiral stairway leading to the floors above and below. The three had evidently left the floor by this avenue. That they had gone down and not up I was sure from my knowledge of these ancient buildings and the methods of the Warhoons. I myself had once been a prisoner of the cruel hordes of northern Warhoon, and the memory of the underground dungeon in which I lay still is vivid in my memory, and so I felt certain that Tarkas lay in the dark pits beneath some nearby building, and that in that direction I should find the trail of the three warriors leading to his cell. Nor was I wrong. At the bottom of the runway, or rather at the landing on the floor below, I saw that the shaft descended into the pits beneath, and as I glanced down, the flickering light of a torch revealed the presence of the three I was trailing. Down they went toward the pits beneath the structure, and at a safe distance behind I followed the flicker of their torch. The way led through a maze of tortuous corridors, unlighted save for the wavering light they carried. We had gone perhaps 100 yards when the party turned abruptly through a doorway at their right. I hastened on as rapidly as I dared through the darkness until I reached the point at which they had left the corridor. There, through an open door, I saw them removing the chains that secured the great Thark, Tarkas, to the wall. Hustling him roughly between them, they came immediately from the chamber, so quickly, in fact, that I was near to being apprehended. But I managed to run along the corridor in the direction I had been going in my pursuit of them, far enough to be without the radius of their meagre light as they emerged from the cell. I had naturally assumed that they would return with Tarkas the same way that they had come, which would have carried them away from me. But to my chagrin, they wheeled directly in my direction as they left the room. There was nothing for me but to hasten on in advance and keep out of the light of their torch. I dared not attempt to halt in the darkness of any of the many intersecting corridors, for I knew nothing of the direction they might take. Chance was as likely as not to carry me into the very corridor they might choose to enter. The sensation of moving rapidly through these dark passages was far from reassuring. I knew not at what moment I might plunge headlong into some terrible pit or meet with some of the ghoulish creatures that inhabit these lower worlds beneath the dead cities of dying Mars. There filtered to me a faint radiance from the torch of the men behind, just enough to permit me to trace the direction of the winding passageways directly before me, and so keep me from dashing myself against the walls at the turns. Presently I came to a place where 5 corridors diverged from a common point. I had hastened along one of them for some little distance when suddenly the faint light of the torch disappeared from behind me. I paused to listen for sounds of the party behind me, but the silence was as utter as the silence of the tomb. Quickly I realized that the warriors had taken one of the other corridors with their prisoner, and so I hastened back with a feeling of considerable relief to take up a much safer and more desirable position behind them. It was much slower work returning, however, than it had been coming, for now the darkness was as utter as the silence. It was necessary to feel every foot of the way back with my hand against the side wall, that I might not pass the spot where the 5 roads radiated. After what seemed an eternity to me, I reached the place and recognized it by groping across the entrances to the several corridors until I had counted 5 of them. In not one, however, showed the faintest sign of light. I listened intently, but the naked feet of the green men sent back no guiding echoes, though presently I thought I detected the clank of sidearms in the far distance of the middle corridor. Up this, then, I hastened, searching for the light and stopping to listen occasionally for a repetition of the sound, but soon I was forced to admit that I must have been following a blind lead, as only darkness and silence rewarded my efforts. Again I retraced my steps toward the parting of the ways, when to my surprise I came upon the entrance to 3 diverging corridors, any one of which I might have traversed in my hasty dash after the false clue I had been following. Here was a pretty fix, indeed. Once back, at the point where the 5 passageways met, I might wait with some assurance for the return of the warriors with Tarkas. My knowledge of their customs lent color to the belief that he was but being escorted to the audience chamber to have sentence passed upon him. I had not the slightest doubt but that they would preserve so doughty a warrior as the great Thark for the rare sport he would furnish at the great games. But unless I could find my way back to that point, the chances were most excellent that I would wander for days through the awful blackness, until, overcome by thirst and hunger, I lay down to die, or— what was that? A faint shuffling sounded behind me, and as I cast a hasty glance over my shoulder, my blood froze in my veins for the thing I saw there. It was not so much fear of the present danger as it was the horrifying memories it recalled of that time I near went mad over the corpse of the man I had killed in the dungeons of the Warhoons, when blazing eyes came out of the dark recesses and dragged the thing that had been a man from my clutches, and I heard it scraping over the stone of my prison as they bore it away to their terrible feast. And now in these black pits of the other Warhoons I looked into those same fiery eyes, blazing at me through the terrible darkness, revealing no sign of the beast behind them. I think that the most fearsome attribute of these awesome creatures is their silence and the fact that one never sees them, nothing but those baleful eyes glaring unblinkingly out of the dark void behind. Grasping my longsword tightly in my hand, I backed slowly along the corridor away from the thing that watched me, but ever as I retreated the eyes advanced, nor was there any sound, not even the sound of breathing, except the occasional shuffling sound, as of the dragging of a dead limb, that had first attracted my attention. On and on I went, but I could not escape my sinister pursuer. Suddenly I heard the shuffling noise at my right, and, looking, saw another pair of eyes, evidently approaching from an intersecting corridor. As I started to renew my slow retreat, I heard the noise repeated behind me, and then before I could turn, I heard it again at my left. The things were all about me. They had me surrounded at the intersection of two corridors. Retreat was cut off in all directions unless I chose to charge one of the beasts. Even then I had no doubt but that the others would hurl themselves upon my back. I could not even guess the size or nature of the weird creatures. That they were of goodly proportions I guessed from the fact that the eyes were on a level with my own. Why is it that darkness so magnifies our dangers? By day I would have charged the great manth itself, had I thought it necessary, but hemmed in by darkness of these silent pits, I hesitated before a pair of eyes. Soon I saw that the matter shortly would be taken entirely from my hands, for the eyes at my right were moving slowly nearer me, as were those at my left and those behind and before me. Gradually they were closing in upon me, but still that awful stealthy silence. For what seemed hours the eyes approached gradually closer and closer, until I felt that I should go mad for the horror of it. I had been constantly turning this way and that to prevent any sudden rush from behind, until I was fairly worn out. At length I could endure it no longer, and taking a fresh grasp upon my longsword, I turned suddenly and charged down upon one of my tormentors. As I was almost upon it, the thing retreated before me, but a sound from behind caused me to wheel in time to see 3 pairs of eyes rushing at me from the rear. With a cry of rage I turned to meet the cowardly beasts, but as I advanced they retreated as had their fellow. Another glance over my shoulder discovered the first eye sneaking on me again, and again I charged, only to see the eyes retreat before me and hear the muffled rush of the 3 at my back. Thus we continued, the eyes always a little closer in the end than they had been before, until I thought that I should go mad with the terrible strain of the ordeal. That they were waiting to spring upon my back seemed evident, and that it would not be long before they succeeded was equally apparent, for I could not endure the wear of this repeated charge and countercharge indefinitely. In fact, I could feel myself weakening from the mental and physical strain I had been undergoing. At that moment I caught another glimpse from the corner of my eye of the single pair of eyes at my back, making a sudden rush upon me. I turned to meet the charge. There was a quick rush of the 3 from the other direction, but I determined to pursue the single pair until I should at least settle my account with one of the beasts, and thus be relieved of the strain of meeting attacks from both directions. There was no sound in the corridor, only that of my own breathing, yet I knew that those 3 uncanny creatures were almost upon me. The eyes in front were not retreating so rapidly now. I was almost within sword reach of them. I raised my sword arm to deal the blow that should free me, and then I felt a heavy body upon my back. A cold, moist, slimy something fastened itself upon my throat. I stumbled and went down. End of chapter 14.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the South Shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 15. Flight and Pursuit. I could not have been unconscious more than a few seconds, and yet I know that I was unconscious, for the next thing I realized was that a growing radiance was illuminating the corridor about me, and the eyes were gone. I was unharmed, except for a slight bruise upon my forehead where it had struck the stone flagging as I fell. I sprang to my feet to ascertain the cause of the light. It came from a torch in the hand of one of a party of 4 green warriors who were coming rapidly down the corridor toward me. They had not yet seen me, and so I lost no time in slipping into the first intersecting corridor that I could find. This time, however, I did not advance so far away from the main corridor as on the other occasion that had resulted in my losing Tarkas and his guards. The party came rapidly toward the opening of the passageway in which I crouched against the wall. As they passed by, I breathed a sigh of relief. I had not been discovered, and, best of all, the party was the same that I had followed into the pits. It consisted of Tarkas and his 3 guards. I fell in behind them, and soon we were at the cell in which the great Thark had been chained. 2 of the warriors remained without, while the man with the keys entered with the Thark to fasten his irons upon him once more. The 2 outside started to stroll slowly in the direction of the spiral runway which led to the floors above, and in a moment were lost to view beyond a turn in the corridor. The torch had been stuck in a socket beside the door, so that its rays illuminated both the corridor and the cell at the same time. As I saw the 2 warriors disappear, I approached the entrance to the cell with a well-defined plan already formulated. While I disliked the thought of carrying out the thing that I had decided upon, there seemed no alternative if Tarkas and I were to go back together to my little camp in the hills. Keeping near the wall, I came quite close to the door to Tarkas' cell, and there I stood with my longsword above my head, grasped with both hands, that I might bring it down in one quick cut upon the skull of the jailer as he emerged. I disliked to dwell upon what followed after I heard the footsteps of the man as he approached the doorway. It is enough that within another minute or 2 Tarkas, wearing the medal of a Warhoon chief, was hurrying down the corridor toward the spiral runway, bearing the Warhoon's torch to light his way. A dozen paces behind him followed John Carter, Prince of Helium. The 2 companions of the man who lay now beside the door of the cell that had been Tarkas's had just started to ascend the runway as the Thark came in view. "Why so long, Tangama?" cried one of the men. "I had trouble with a lock," replied Tarkas, "and now I find that I have left my short sword in the Thark's cell. Go you on, I'll return and fetch it." "As you will, Tangama," replied he who had before spoken. "We shall see you above directly." "Yes," replied Tarkas, and turned as though to retrace his steps to the cell. But he only waited until the 2 had disappeared at the floor above. Then I joined him. We extinguished the torch, and together we crept toward the spiral incline that led to the upper floors of the building. At the first floor we found that the hallway ran but halfway through, necessitating the crossing of a rear room full of green folk, ere we could reach the inner courtyard. So there was but one thing left for us to do, and that was to gain the second floor and the hallway through which I had traversed the length of the building. Cautiously we ascended. We could hear the sounds of conversation coming from the room above, but the hall still was unlighted, nor was anyone in sight as we gained the top of the runway. Together we threaded the long hall and reached the balcony overlooking the courtyard without being detected. At our right was the window letting into the room in which I had seen Tangama and the other warriors as they started to Tarkas' cell earlier in the evening. His companions had returned here, and we now overheard a portion of their conversation. "What can be detaining Tangama?" asked one. "He certainly could not be all this time fetching his short sword from the Thark's cell," spoke another. "His short sword?" asked a woman. "What mean you?" "Tangama left his short sword in the Thark's cell," explained the first speaker, "and left us at the runway to return and get it." "Tangama wore no short sword this night," said the woman. "It was broken in today's battle with the Thark, and Tangama gave it to me to repair. See, I have it here." And as she spoke, she drew Tangama's short sword from beneath her sleeping silks and furs. The warriors sprang to their feet. "There is something amiss here," cried one. "'Tis even what I myself thought when Tangama left us at the runway," said another. "Methought then that his voice sounded strangely. Come, let us hasten to the pits." We waited to hear no more. Slinging my harness into a long single strap, I lowered Tarkas to the courtyard beneath, and an instant later dropped to his side. We had spoken scarcely a dozen words since I had felled Tangama at the cell door and seen in the torch's light the expression of utter bewilderment upon the great Thark's face. "By this time," he had said, "I should have learned to wonder at nothing which John Carter accomplishes." That was all. He did not need to tell me that he appreciated the friendship which had prompted me to risk my life to rescue him, nor did he need to say that he was glad to see me. This fierce green warrior had been the first to greet me that day, now 20 years gone, which had witnessed my first advent upon Mars. He had met me with levelled spear and cruel hatred in his heart, as he charged down upon me, bending low at the side of his mighty thwart, as I stood beside the incubator of his horde upon the Dead Sea bottom beyond Korab. And now among the inhabitants of 2 worlds I counted none a better friend than Tartarchus, Jeddak of Tharks. As we reached the courtyard, we stood in the shadows beneath the balcony for a moment to discuss our plans. "There be 5 now in the party, Tartarchus," I said. "Thuvia, Exedar, Carthoris, and ourselves. We shall need 5 thwarts to bear us." "Carthoris!" he cried. "Your son?" "Yes, I found him in the prison of Shador on the Sea of Omin, in the land of the firstborn." "I know not any of these places, John Carter. Be they upon Barsoom?" "Upon and below, my friend. But wait until we shall have made good our escape, and you shall hear the strangest narrative that ever a Barsoomian of the outer world gave ear to. Now we must steal our thwarts and be well away to the north before these fellows discover how we have tricked them." In safety we reached the great gates at the far end of the courtyard, through which it was necessary to take our thwarts to the avenue beyond. It is no easy matter to handle 5 of these great fierce beasts, which by nature are as wild and ferocious as their masters, and held in subjection by cruelty and brute force alone. As we approached them they sniffed our unfamiliar scent, and with squeals of rage circled about us. Their long, massive necks upreared raised their great gaping mouths high above our heads. They are fearsome-appearing brutes at best, but when they are aroused they are fully as dangerous as they look. The thoat stands a good 10 feet at the shoulder. His hide is sleek and hairless, and of a dark slate color on back and sides, shading down his 8 legs to a vivid yellow at the huge, padded, nailless feet. The belly is pure white. A broad, flat tail, larger at the tip than at the root, completes the picture of this ferocious green Martian mount, a fit war steed for these warlike people. As the thwarts are guided by telepathic means alone, there is no need for rein or bridle, and so our object now was to find 2 that would obey our unspoken commands. As they charged about us, we succeeded in mastering them sufficiently to prevent any concerted attack upon us, but the din of their squealing was certain to bring investigating warriors into the courtyard were it to continue much longer. At length I was successful in reaching the side of one great brute, and ere he knew what I was about I was firmly seated astride his glossy back. A moment later Tartarchus had caught and mounted another. Then between us we herded 3 or 4 more toward the great gates. Tartarchus rode ahead, and leaning down to the latch threw the barriers open, while I held the loose thoats from breaking back to the herd. Then together we rode through the avenues with our stolen mounts, and, without waiting to close the gates, hurried off toward the southern boundary of the city. Thus far our escape had been little short of marvelous, nor did our good fortune desert us, for we passed the outer purlieus of the dead city and came to our camp without hearing even the faintest sound of pursuit. Here a low whistle, the prearranged signal, appraised the balance of our party that I was returning, and we were met by the 3 with every manifestation of enthusiastic rejoicing. But little time was wasted in narration of our adventure. Tartarchus and Carthoris exchanged the dignified and formal greetings common upon Barsoom, but I could tell intuitively that Thark loved my boy, and that Carthoris reciprocated his affection. Exedar and the green Jeddak were formally presented to each other. Then Thuvia was lifted to the least fractious thwart. Exedar and Carthoris mounted 2 others, and we set out at a rapid pace toward the east. At the far extremity of the city we circled toward the north, and under the glorious rays of the 2 moons we sped noiselessly across the Dead Sea bottom, away from the Warhoons and the firstborn, but to what new dangers and adventures we knew not. Toward noon of the following day we halted to rest our mounts and ourselves. The beasts were hobbled, that they might move slowly about, cropping the ochre moss-like vegetation which constitutes both food and drink for them on the march. Thuvia volunteered to remain on watch while the balance of the party slept for an hour. It seemed to me that I had but closed my eyes when I felt her hand upon my shoulder and heard her soft voice warning me of a new danger. "Arise, O Prince," she whispered. "There be that behind us which has the appearance of a great body of pursuers." The girl stood pointing in the direction from whence we had come, and as I arose and looked, I, too, thought that I could detect a thin dark line on the far horizon. I awoke the others. Tarkus, whose giant stature towered high above the rest of us, could see the farthest. "It is a great body of mounted men," he said, "and they are traveling at high speed." There was no time to be lost. We sprang to our hobbled thoats, freed them, and mounted. Then we turned our faces once more toward the north, and took our flight again at the highest speed of our slowest beast. For the balance of the day and all the following night we raced across the ochre wilderness, with the pursuers at our back ever gaining upon us. Slowly but surely they were lessening the distance between us. Just before dark they had been close enough for us to plainly distinguish that they were green Martians, and all during the long night we distinctly heard the clanking of their accoutrements behind us. As the sun rose on the second day of our flight, it disclosed the pursuing horde not a half-mile in our rear. As they saw us, a fiendish shout of triumph rose from their ranks. Several miles in advance lay a range of hills, the further shore of the Dead Sea we had been crossing. Could we but reach these hills, our chances of escape would be greatly enhanced. But Thuvia's mount, although carrying the lightest burden, already was showing signs of exhaustion. I was riding beside her when suddenly her animal staggered and lurched against mine. I saw that he was going down, but ere he fell I snatched the girl from his back and swung her to a place upon my own thoat, behind me, where she clung with her arms about me. This double burden soon proved too much for my already overtaxed beast, and thus our speed was terribly diminished, for the others would proceed no faster than the slowest of us could go. In that little party there was not one who would desert another, yet we were of different countries, different colors, different races, different religions, and one of us was of a different world. We were quite close to the hills, but the Warhoons were gaining so rapidly that we had given up all hope of reaching them in time. Thuvia and I were in the rear, for our beast was lagging more and more. Suddenly I felt the girl's warm lips press a kiss upon my shoulder. "For thy sake, O my prince," she murmured. Then her arms slipped from about my waist, and she was gone. I turned and saw that she had deliberately slipped to the ground in the very path of the cruel demons who pursued us, thinking that by lightening the burden of my mount it might thus be enabled to bear me to the safety of the hills. Poor child! She should have known John Carter better than that. Turning my thoat, I urged him after her, hoping to reach her side and bear her on again in our hopeless flight. Carthoris must have glanced behind him at about the same time and taken in the situation, for by the time I had reached Thuvia's side he was there also, and springing from his mount he threw her upon its back, and turning the animal's head toward the hills, gave the beast a sharp crack across the rump with the flat of his sword. Then he attempted to do the same with mine. The brave boy's act of chivalrous self-sacrifice filled me with pride, nor did I care that it had wrested from us our last frail chance for escape. The Warhoons were now close upon us. Tarkus and Exedar had discovered our absence and were charging rapidly to our support. Everything pointed toward a splendid ending of my second journey to Barsoom. I hated to go out without having seen my divine princess, and held her in my arms once again. But if it were not writ upon the book of fate that such was to be, then would I take the most that was coming to me, and in these last few moments that were to be vouchsafed me before I passed over into that unguessed future, I could at least give such an account of myself in my chosen vocation as would leave the Warhoons of the South food for discourse for the next 20 generations. As Carthoris was not mounted, I slipped from the back of my own mount and took my place at his side to meet the charge of the howling devils bearing down upon us. A moment later Tarkus and Exedar ranged themselves on either hand, turning their thoats loose that we might all be on equal footing. The Warhoons were perhaps 100 yards from us when a loud explosion sounded from above and behind us, and almost at the same instant a shell burst in their advancing ranks. At once all was confusion. 100 warriors toppled to the ground. Riderless thoats plunged hither and thither among the dead and dying. Dismounted warriors were trampled underfoot in the stampede which followed. All semblance of order had left the ranks of the green men, and as they looked far above our heads to trace the origin of this unexpected attack, disorder turned to retreat, and retreat to a wild panic. In another moment they were racing as madly away from us as they had before been charging down upon us. We turned to look in the direction from whence the first report had come, and there we saw, just clearing the tops of the nearer hills, a great battleship swinging majestically through the air. Her bow gun spoke again even as we looked, and another shell burst among the fleeing Warhoons. As she drew nearer, I could not repress a wild cry of elation, for upon her bows I saw the device of helium. End of chapter 15.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 16. Under Arrest. As Carthoris, Exodarm, Tarstarchus, and I stood gazing at the magnificent vessel which meant so much to all of us, we saw a second and then a third top the summit of the hills and glide gracefully after their sister. Now a score of one-man air scouts were launching from the upper decks of the nearer vessel, and in a moment more were speeding in long swift dives to the ground about us. In another instant we were surrounded by armed sailors, and an officer had stepped forward to address us, when his eyes fell upon Carthoris. With an exclamation of surprised pleasure he sprang forward, and placing his hands upon the boy's shoulder, called him by name. "Carthoris, my prince!" he cried. "Caor, Caor! Horvastus greets the son of Dejah Thoris, princess of Helium, and of her husband John Carter. Where have you been, O my prince? All Helium has plunged in sorrow. Terrible have been the calamities that have befallen your great-grandsire's mighty nation since the fatal day that saw you leave our midst." "Grieve not, my good Horvastus," cried Carthoris, "since I bring not back myself alone to cheer my mother's heart and the hearts of my beloved people, but also one whom all Barsoom loved best, her greatest warrior and her savior, John Carter, Prince of Helium." Horvastus turned in the direction indicated by Carthoris, and as his eyes fell upon me he was like to have collapsed from sheer surprise. "John Carter!" he exclaimed, and then a sudden troubled look came into his eyes. "My prince," he started, "where hast thou—" And then he stopped, but I knew the question that his lips dared not frame. The loyal fellow would not be the one to force from mine a confession of the terrible truth that I had returned from the bosom of the Ish, the river of mystery, back from the shore of the lost sea of Chorus and the valley Dor. "Ah, my prince," he continued, as though no thought had interrupted his greeting, "that you are back is sufficient, and let Horvastus' sword have the high honor of being first at thy feet." With these words the noble fellow unbuckled his scabbard and flung his sword upon the ground before me. Could you know the customs and the character of red Martians, you would appreciate the depth of meaning that simple act conveyed to me and to all about us who witnessed it. The thing was equivalent to saying, "My sword, my body, my life, my soul are yours to do with as you wish. Until death and after death I look to you alone for authority for my every act. Be you right or wrong, your word shall be my only truth. Whoso raises his hand against you must answer to my sword." It is the oath of fealty that men occasionally pay to a Jeddak whose high character and chivalrous acts have inspired the enthusiastic love of his followers. Never had I known this high tribute paid to a lesser mortal. There was but one response possible. I stooped and lifted the sword from the ground, raised the hilt to my lips, and then, stepping to Horvastus, I buckled the weapon upon him with my own hands. "Horvastus," I said, placing my hand upon his shoulder, "you know best the promptings of your own heart. That I shall need your sword I have little doubt, but accept from John Carter upon his sacred honor the assurance that he will never call upon you to draw the sword other than in the cause of truth, justice, and righteousness." "That I knew, my prince," he replied, "ere ever I threw my beloved blade at thy feet." As we spoke, other flyers came and went between the ground and the battleship, and presently a larger boat was launched from above, one capable of carrying a dozen persons, perhaps, and dropped lightly near us. As she touched, an officer sprang from her deck to the ground, and advancing to Horvastus saluted. "Cantos Can desires that this party whom we have rescued be brought immediately to the deck of the Exavarian," he said. As we approached the little craft, I looked about for the members of my party, and for the first time noticed that Thuvia was not among them. Questioning elicited the fact that none had seen her since Carthoris had sent her thoat galloping madly toward the hills, in the hope of carrying her out of harm's way. Immediately Horvastus dispatched a dozen air scouts in as many directions to search for her. It could not be possible that she had gone far since we had last seen her. We others stepped to the deck of the craft that had been sent to fetch us, and a moment later we were upon the Exavarian. The first man to greet me was Kantos Kan himself. My old friend had won to the highest place in the navy of Helium, but he was still to me the same brave comrade who had shared with me the privations of a Warnhoon dungeon, the terrible atrocities of the great games, and later the dangers of our search for Dejathoros within the hostile city of Zodanga. Then I had been an unknown wanderer upon a strange planet, and he a simple padwar in the navy of Helium. Today he commanded all Helium's great terrors of the skies, and I was a prince of the house of Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium. He did not ask me where I had been. Like Horvastus, he too dreaded the truth, and would not be the one to wrest a statement from me. That it must come sometime he well knew, but until it came he seemed satisfied to but know that I was with him once more. He greeted Carthoris and Tars Tarkas with the keenest delight, but he asked neither where he had been. He could scarcely keep his hands off the boy. "You do not know, John Carter," he said to me, "how we of Helium love this son of yours. It is as though all the great love we bore his noble father and his poor mother had been centered in him. When it became known that he was lost, 10 million people wept." "What mean you, Kantos Kan?" I whispered. "By his poor mother." For the words had seemed to carry a sinister meaning which I could not fathom. He drew me to one side. "For a year," he said, "ever since Carthoris disappeared, Dejathoros has grieved and mourned for her lost boy. The blow of years ago, when you did not return from the atmosphere plant, was lessened to some extent by the duties of motherhood, for your son broke his white shell that very night. That she suffered terribly then all Helium knew, for did not all Helium suffer with her the loss of her lord? But with the boy gone there was nothing left, and after expedition upon expedition returned with the same hopeless tale of no clue as to his whereabouts, our beloved princess drooped lower and lower, until all who saw her felt that it could be but a matter of days ere she went to join her loved ones within the precincts of the valley door. As a last resort, Mors Kajak, her father, and Tardos Mors, her grandfather, took command of 2 mighty expeditions, and a month ago sailed away to explore every inch of ground in the northern hemisphere of Barsoom. For 2 weeks no word has come back from them, but rumors were rife that they had met with a terrible disaster, and that all were dead. About this time Zataras renewed his importunities for her hand in marriage. He has been forever after her since you disappeared. She hated him and feared him, but with both her father and grandfather gone, Zataras was very powerful, for he is still Jed of Zodanga, to which position, you will remember, Tardos Mors appointed him, after you had refused the honor. He had a secret audience with her 6 days ago. What took place none knows, but the next day Dejathoros had disappeared, and with her had gone a dozen of her household guard and body servants, including Sola the Green Woman, Tars Tarkas' daughter, you recall. No word left they of their intentions, but it is always thus with those who go upon the voluntary pilgrimage from which none returns. We cannot think aught than that Dejathoros has sought the icy bosom of Ish, and that her devoted servants have chosen to accompany her. Zataras was at Helium when she disappeared. He commands this fleet which has been searching for her since. No trace of her have we found, and I fear that it be a futile quest." While we talked, Horvastus's flyers were returning to the Exavarian. Not one, however, had discovered a trace of Thuvia. I was much depressed over the news of Dejathoros' disappearance, and now there was added the further burden of apprehension concerning the fate of this girl, whom I believed to be the daughter of some proud Barsoomian house, and it had been my intention to make every effort to return her to her people. I was about to ask Kantos Kan to prosecute a further search for her, when a flyer from the flagship of the fleet arrived at the Exavarian with an officer bearing a message to Kantos Kan from Aris. My friend read the dispatch and then turned to me. "Zataras commands me to bring our prisoners before him. There is naught else to do. He is supreme in Helium, yet it would be far more in keeping with chivalry and good taste were he to come hither and greet the saviour of Barsoom with the honours that are his due." "You know full well, my friend," I said smiling, "that Zataras has good cause to hate me. Nothing would please him better than to humiliate me and then to kill me. Now that he has so excellent an excuse, let us go and see if he has the courage to take advantage of it." Summoning Carthoris, Tars Tarkas, and Exodar, we entered the small flyer with Kantos Kan and Zataras' officer, and in a moment we were stepping to the deck of Zataras' flagship. As we approached the Jed of Zodanga, no sign of greeting or recognition crossed his face, Not even to Carthoris did he vouchsafe a friendly word. His attitude was cold, haughty, and uncompromising. "Kaor, Zat-Aris," I said in greeting, but he did not respond. "Why were these prisoners not disarmed?" he asked to Kantos Kan. "They are not prisoners, Zat-Aris," replied the officer. "Two of them are of Helium's noblest family. Tars Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, is Tardos Mors' best beloved ally. The other is a friend and companion of the Prince of Helium. That is enough for me to know." "It is not enough for me, however," retorted Zat-Aris. "More must I hear from those who have taken the pilgrimage than their names. Where have you been, John Carter?" "I have just come from the Valley Dor and the land of the firstborn, Zat-Aris," I replied. "Ah!" he exclaimed in evident pleasure. "You do not deny it, then? You have returned from the bosom of Ish." "I have come back from a land of false hope, from a valley of torture and death. With my companions I have escaped from the hideous clutches of lying fiends. I have come back to the Barsoom that I saved from a painless death to again save her, but this time from death in its most frightful form." "Cease, blasphemer!" cried Zat-Aris. "Hope not to save thy cowardly carcass by inventing horrid lies to—" But he got no further. One does not call John Carter coward and liar thus lightly, and Zat-Aris should have known it. Before a hand could be raised to stop me, I was at his side, and one hand grasped his throat. "Come I from heaven or hell, Zat-Aris, you will find me still the same John Carter that I've always been, nor did ever man call me such names and live without apologizing." And with that I commenced to bend him back across my knee and tighten my grip upon his throat. "Seize him!" cried Zat-Aris, and a dozen officers sprang forward to assist him. Kantos Kan came close and whispered to me, "Desist, I beg of you. It will but involve us all, for I cannot see these men lay hands upon you without aiding you. My officers and men will join me, and we shall have a mutiny then, that may lead to the revolution. For the sake of Tardos Mors and Helium, desist." At his words I released Zat-Aris, and turning my back upon him, walked toward the ship's rail. "Come, Kantos Kan," I said. "The Prince of Helium would return to the Exavarian." None interfered. Zat-Aris stood white and trembling amidst his officers. Some there were who looked upon him with scorn and drew toward me, while one, a man long in the service and confidence of Tardos Mors, spoke to me in a low tone as I passed him. "You may count my medal among your fighting men, John Carter," he said. I thanked him and passed on. In silence we embarked, and shortly after stepped once more upon the deck of the Exavarian. 15 minutes later we received orders from the flagship to proceed toward Helium. Our journey thither was uneventful. Carthoris and I were wrapped in the gloomiest of thoughts. Kantos Kan was somber in contemplation of the further calamity that might fall upon Helium should Zat-Aris attempt to follow the age-old precedent that allotted a terrible death to fugitives from the Valley Dor. Tars Tarkas grieved for the loss of his daughter. Exodar alone was carefree, a fugitive and outlaw. He could be no worse off in Helium than elsewhere. "Let us hope that we may at least go out with good red blood upon our blades," he said. It was a simple wish, and one most likely to be gratified. Among the officers of Exavarian I thought I could discern division into fractions ere we had reached Helium. There were those who gathered about Carthoris and myself whenever the opportunity presented, while about an equal number held aloof from us. They offered us only the most courteous treatment, but were evidently bound by their superstitious belief in the doctrine of Dor and Ish and Chorus. I could not blame them, for I knew how strong a hold a creed, however ridiculous it may be, may gain upon an otherwise intelligent people. By returning from Dor we had committed a sacrilege. By recounting our adventures there, and stating the facts as they existed, we had outraged the religion of their fathers. We were blasphemers, lying heretics. Even those who still clung to us from personal love and loyalty I think did so in the face of the fact that at heart they questioned our veracity. It is very hard to accept a new religion for an old, no matter how alluring the promises of the new may be. But to reject the old as a tissue of falsehoods without being offered anything in its stead is indeed a most difficult thing to ask of any people. Kantos Kan would not talk of our experiences among the Therns and the firstborn. "It is enough," he said, "that I jeopardize my life here and hereafter by countenancing you all. Do not ask me to add still further to my sins by listening to what I've always been taught was the rankest heresy." I knew that sooner or later the time must come when our friends and enemies would be forced to declare themselves openly. When we reached Helium there must be an accounting, and if Tardos Mors had not returned, I feared that the enmity of Zadaris might weigh heavily against us, for he represented the government of Helium. To take sides against him were equivalent to treason. The majority of the troops would doubtless follow the lead of their officers, and I knew that many of the highest and most powerful men of both land and air forces would cleave to John Carter in the face of God, man, or devil. On the other hand, the majority of the populace unquestionably would demand that we pay the penalty of our sacrilege. The outlook seemed dark from whatever angle I viewed it, but my mind was so torn with anguish at the thought of Dejah Thoris that I realized now that I gave the terrible question of Helium's plight but scant attention at that time. There was always before me, day and night, a horrible nightmare of the frightful scenes through which I knew my princess might even then be passing, the horrid plantmen, the ferocious white apes. At times I would cover my face with my hands in a vain effort to shut out the fearful thing from my mind. It was in the forenoon that we arrived above the mile-high scarlet tower which marks Greater Helium from her twin city. As we descended in great circles toward the navy docks, a mighty multitude could be seen surging in the streets beneath. Helium had been notified by radio aerogram of our approach. From the deck of the Exaverian, we four, Carthoris, Tars Tarkas, Exodar, and I, were transferred to a lesser flyer to be transported to quarters within the Temple of Reward. It is here that Martian justice is meted to benefactor or malefactor. Here the hero is decorated. Here the felon is condemned. We were taken into the temple from the landing stage upon the roof, so that we did not pass among the people at all, as is customary. Always before I had seen prisoners of note or returned wanderers of eminence paraded from the gate of Jedex to the Temple of Reward, up the broad avenue of ancestors, through dense crowds of jeering or cheering citizens. I knew that Zadaris dared not trust the people near to us, for he feared that their love for Carthoris and myself might break into a demonstration which would wipe out their superstitious horror of the crime we were to be charged with. What his plans were I could only guess, but that they were sinister was evidenced by the fact that only his most trusted servitors accompanied us upon the flyer to the Temple of Reward. We were lodged in a room upon the south side of the temple, overlooking the avenue of ancestors, down which we could see the full length to the gate of Jedex, 5 miles away. The people in the temple plaza and in the streets for a distance of a full mile were standing as close packed as it was possible for them to get. They were very orderly. There were neither scoffs nor plaudits, and when they saw us at the window above them, there were many who buried their faces in their arms and wept. Late in the afternoon a messenger arrived from Zadaris to inform us that we would be tried by an impartial body of nobles in the great hall of the temple at the Verse Zod *, on the following day, or at about 8:40 a.m. Earth time. Wherever Captain Carter has used Martian measurements of time, distance, weight, and the like, I have translated them into as nearly their equivalent in earthly values as is possible. His notes contain many Martian tables and a great volume of scientific data, but since the International Astronomic Society is at present engaged in classifying, investigating, and verifying this vast fund of remarkable and valuable information, I have felt that it will add nothing to the interest of Captain Carter's story or to the sum total of human knowledge to maintain a strict adherence to the original manuscript in these matters, while it might readily confuse the reader and detract from the interest of the history. For those who may be interested, however, I will explain that the Martian day is a trifle over 24 hours 37 minutes duration, Earth time. This the Martians divide into 10 equal parts, commencing the day at about 6 a.m., Earth time. The Zodes are divided into 50 shorter periods, each of which in turn is composed of 200 brief periods of time, about equivalent to the earthly second. The Barsoomian table of time, as here given, is but a part of the full table appearing in Captain Carter's notes. Table: 200 tals, 1 x, 50 x, 1 zode, 10 zodes, 1 revolution of Mars upon its axis. End of chapter 16.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 17. The Death Sentence. A few moments before the appointed time on the following morning, a strong guard of Zadaras's officers appeared at our quarters to conduct us to the great hall of the temple. In twos we entered the chamber and marched down the broad aisle of hope, as it is called, to the platform in the center of the hall. Before and behind us marched armed guards, while 3 solid ranks of Zodangan soldiery lined either side of the aisle from the entrance to the rostrum. As we reached the raised enclosure, I saw our judges. As is the custom upon Barsoom, there were 31, supposedly selected by lot from men of the noble class, for nobles were on trial. But to my amazement I saw no single friendly face among them. Practically all were Zodangans, and it was I to whom Zodanga owed her defeat at the hands of the Green Hordes, and her subsequent vassalage to Helium. There could be little justice here for John Carter, or his son, or for the great Thark who had commanded the savage tribesmen who overran Zodanga's broad avenues, looting, burning, and murdering. About us the vast circular Colosseum was packed to its full capacity. All classes were represented, all ages and both sexes. As we entered the hall, the hum of subdued conversation ceased until as we halted upon the platform, or throne of righteousness, the silence of death enveloped the 10,000 spectators. The judges were seated in a great circle about the periphery of the circular platform. We were assigned seats with our backs toward a small platform in the exact center of the larger one. This placed us facing the judges and the audience. Upon the smaller platform, each would take his place while his case was being heard. Zadaras himself sat in the golden chair of the presiding magistrate. As we were seated and our guards retired to the foot of the stairway leading to the platform, he arose and called my name. "John Carter," he cried, "take your place upon the pedestal of truth to be judged impartially, according to your acts, and here to know the reward you have earned thereby." Then turning to and fro toward the audience, he narrated the acts upon the value of which my reward was to be determined. "Know you, O judges and people of Helium," he said, "that John Carter, one time Prince of Helium, has returned by his own statement from the valley door, and even from the temple of Ishis itself. That, in the presence of many men of Helium, he has blasphemed against the sacred Ish, and against the valley door, and the lost sea of Chorus, and the holy Therns themselves, and even against Ishis, goddess of death and of life eternal. And know you further, by witness of thine own eyes, that see him here now, upon the pedestal of truth, that he has indeed returned from these sacred precincts, in the face of our ancient customs, and in violation of the sanctity of our ancient religion. He who be once dead may not live again. He who attempts it must be made dead forever. Judges, your duty lies plain before you. Here can be no testimony in contravention of truth. What reward shall be meted to John Carter in accordance with the acts he has committed?" "Death!" shouted one of the judges. And then a man sprang to his feet in the audience, and raising his hand on high, cried, "Justice! Justice! Justice!" It was Kantos Kan, and as all eyes turned toward him, he leaped past the Zodangan soldiery and sprang upon the platform. "What manner of justice be this?" he cried to Zadaras. "The defendant has not been heard, nor has he had an opportunity to call others in his behalf. In the name of the people of Helium, I demand fair and impartial treatment for the Prince of Helium." A great cry arose from the audience then, "Justice! Justice! Justice!" and Zadaras dared not deny them. "Speak then," he snarled, turning to me, "but blaspheme not against the things that are sacred upon Barsoom." "Men of Helium," I cried, turning to the spectators and speaking over the heads of my judges, "how can John Carter expect justice from the men of Zodanga? He cannot, nor does he ask it. It is to the men of Helium that he states his case, nor does he appeal for mercy to any. It is not in his own cause that he speaks now, it is in thine, in the cause of your wives and daughters, and of wives and daughters yet unborn. It is to save them from the unthinkably atrocious indignities that I have seen heaped upon the fair women of Barsoom in the place men call the Temple of Ishis. It is to save them from the sucking embrace of the plant men, from the fangs of the great white apes of Dor, from the cruel lust of the holy Therns, from all that the cold, dead Ish carries them to, from homes of love and life and happiness." Sits there no man here who does not know the history of John Carter, how he came among you from another world, and rose from a prisoner among the green men, through torture and persecution, to a high place among the highest of Barsoom. Nor ever did you know John Carter to lie in his own behalf, or to say aught that might harm the people of Barsoom, or to speak lightly of the strange religion which he respected without understanding. There be no man here or elsewhere upon Barsoom today who does not owe his life directly to a single act of mine, in which I sacrificed myself and the happiness of my princess that you might live. And so, men of Helium, I think that I have the right to demand that I be heard, that I be believed, and that you let me serve you and save you from the false hereafter of Dor and Ishis, as I saved you from the real death that other day. It is to you of Helium that I speak now. When I am done, let the men of Zodanga have their will with me. Zadars has taken my sword from me, so the men of Zodanga no longer fear me. Will you listen? Speak, John Carter, Prince of Helium, cried a great noble from the audience, and the multitude echoed his permission, until the building rocked with the noise of their demonstration. Zadars knew better than to interfere with such a sentiment as was expressed that day in the Temple of Reward, and so for 2 hours I talked with the people of Helium. But when I had finished, Zadars arose, and turning to the judges, said in a low tone, My nobles, you have heard John Carter's plea. Every opportunity has been given him to prove his innocence, if he be not guilty. But instead he has but utilized the time in further blasphemy. What, gentlemen, is your verdict? Death to the blasphemer, cried one, springing to his feet, and in an instant the entire 31 judges were on their feet, with upraised swords in token of their unanimity of their verdict. If the people did not hear Zadaras's charge, they certainly did hear the verdict of the tribunal. A sullen murmur rose louder and louder about the packed Colosseum, and then Cantos Can, who had not left the platform since first he had taken his place near me, raised his hand for silence. When he could be heard, he spoke to the people in a cool and level voice. You have heard the fate that the men of Zodanga would meet to Helium's noblest hero. It may be the duty of the men of Helium to accept the verdict as final. Let each man act according to his own heart. Here is the answer of Cantos Can, head of the navy of Helium, to Zadaras and his judges. And with that he unbuckled his scabbard and threw his sword at my feet. In an instant soldiers and citizens, officers and nobles were crowding past the soldiers of Zodanga, and forcing their way to the throne of righteousness. 100 men surged upon the platform, and 100 blades rattled and clanked to the floor at my feet. Zadars and his officers were furious, but they were helpless. One by one I raised the swords to my lips and buckled them again upon their owners. Come, said Cantos Can, we will escort John Carter and his party to his own palace. And they formed about us and started toward the stairs leading to the Isle of Hope. Stop, cried Zadaras. Soldiers of Helium, let no prisoner leave the throne of righteousness. The soldiery from Zodanga were the only organized body of Heliumetic troops within the temple, so Zadaras was confident that his orders would be obeyed. But I do not think that he looked for the opposition that was raised the moment the soldiers advanced towards the throne. From every quarter of the Colosseum swords flashed, and men rushed threatening upon the Zodangans. Someone raised a cry. Tardos Mors is dead. 1,000 years to John Carter, Jeddak of Helium. As I heard that, and saw the ugly attitude of the men of Helium toward the soldiers of Zadaras, I knew that only a miracle could avert a clash that would end in civil war. Hold, I cried, leaping to the pedestal of truth once more. Let no man move till I am done. A single sword thrust here today may plunge Helium into a bitter and bloody war, the results of which none can foresee. It will turn brother against brother and father against son. No man's life is worth that sacrifice. Rather would I submit to the biased judgment of Zadaras than be the cause of civil strife in Helium. Let us each give in a point to the other, and let this entire matter rest until Tardos Mors returns, or Mors Kajak his son. If neither be back at the end of a year, a second trial may be held. The thing has a precedent. And then turning to Zadaras, I said in a low voice, Unless you be a bigger fool than I take you to be, you will grasp the chance I am offering you, ere it is too late. Once that multitude of swords below is drawn against your soldiery, no man upon Barsoom, not even Tardos Mors himself, can avert the consequences. What say you? Speak quickly. The jet of Zodangan helium raised his voice to the angry sea beneath us. "Stay your hands, men of helium," he shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "The sentence of the court is passed, but the day of retribution has not been set. I, Zadaris, jet of Zodanga, appreciating the royal connections of the prisoner and his past services to Helium and Barsoom, grant a respite of 1 year, or until the return of Mors Kajak, or Tardos Mors to Helium. Disperse quietly to your houses. Go." No one moved. Instead, they stood in tense silence with their eyes fastened upon me, as though waiting for a signal to attack. "Clear the temple," commanded Zadaris in a low tone to one of his officers. Fearing the result of an attempt to carry out this order by force, I stepped to the edge of the platform and, pointing toward the main entrance, bid them pass out. As one man they turned at my request and filed, silent and threatening, past the soldiers of Zadaris, jet of Zodanga, who stood scowling in impotent rage. Kantos Kan, with the others who had sworn allegiance to me, still stood upon the throne of righteousness with me. "Come," said Kantos Kan to me, "we will escort you to your palace, my prince. Come, Cathoris and Exodar. Come, Tars Tarkas." And with a haughty sneer for Zadaris upon his handsome lips, he turned and strode to the throne steps and up the Isle of Hope. We 4 and the 100 loyal ones followed behind him, nor was a hand raised to stay us, though glowering eyes followed our triumphant march through the temple. In the avenues we found a press of people, but they opened a pathway for us, and many were the swords that were flung at my feet as I passed through the city of Helium toward my palace upon the outskirts. Here my old slaves fell upon their knees and kissed my hands as I greeted them. They cared not where I had been. It was enough that I had returned to them. "Ah, master," cried one, "if our divine princess were but here, this would be a day indeed." Tears came to my eyes so that I was forced to turn away that I might hide my emotions. Carthoris wept openly as the slaves pressed about him with expressions of affection and words of sorrow for our common loss. It was now that Tars Tarkas for the first time learned that his daughter, Sola, had accompanied Dejah Thoris upon the last long pilgrimage. I had not had the heart to tell him what Kantos Kan had told me. With the stoicism of the Green Martian, he showed no sign of suffering, yet I knew that his grief was as poignant as mine. In marked contrast to his kind, he had in well-developed form the kindlier human characteristics of love, friendship, and charity. It was a sad and somber party that sat at the feast of welcome in the great dining hall of the palace of the Prince of Helium that day. We were over 100 strong, not counting the members of my little court, for Dejah Thoris and I had maintained a household consistent with our royal rank. The board, according to Red Martian custom, was triangular, for there were 3 in our family. Carthoris and I presided in the center of our sides of the table. Midway of the third side, Dejah Thoris's high-backed carven chair stood vacant except for her gorgeous wedding trappings and jewels which were draped upon it. Behind stood a slave as in the days when his mistress had occupied her place at the board, ready to do her bidding. It was the way upon Barsoom, so I endured the anguish of it, though it wrung my heart to see that silent chair where it should have been my laughing and vivacious princess keeping the great hall ringing with her merry gaiety. At my right sat Kantos Kan, while to the right of Dejah Thoris's empty place Tars Tarkas sat in a huge chair before a raised section of the board which years ago I had had constructed to meet the requirements of his mighty bulk. The place of honor at a Martian horde is always at the hostess's right, and this place was ever reserved by Dejah Thoris for the great Thark upon the occasions that he was in Helium. Horvastus sat in the seat of honor upon Carthoris's side of the table. There was little general conversation. It was a quiet and saddened party. The loss of Dejah Thoris was still fresh in the minds of all, and to this was added fear for the safety of Tardos Mors and Mors Kajak, as well as doubt and uncertainty as to the fate of Helium, should it prove true that she was permanently deprived of her great Jeddak. Suddenly our attention was attracted by the sound of distant shouting, as of many people raising their voices at once, but whether in anger or rejoicing we could not tell. Nearer and nearer came the tumult. A slave rushed into the dining hall to cry that a great concourse of people was swarming through the palace gates. A second burst upon the heels of the first, alternately laughing and shrieking as a madman. "Dejah Thoris is found!" he cried. "A messenger from Dejah Thoris!" I waited to hear no more, The great windows of the dining hall overlooked the avenue leading to the main gates. They were upon the opposite side of the hall from me, with the table intervening. I did not waste time encircling the great board. With a single leap I cleared table and diners and sprang upon the balcony beyond. 30 feet below lay the scarlet sward of the lawn, and beyond were many people crowding about a great thoat which bore a rider headed toward the palace. I vaulted to the ground below and ran swiftly toward the advancing party. As I came near to them I saw that the figure on the thoat was Sola. "Where's the Princess of Helium?" I cried. The green girl slid from her mighty mount and ran toward me. "Oh, my prince, she cried. "She's gone forever. Even now she may be a captive upon the lesser moon. The black pirates of Barsoom have stolen her." End of chapter 17.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the South Shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 18. Sola's Story. Once within the palace I drew Sola to the dining hall, and when she had greeted her father after the formal manner of the green men, she told the story of the pilgrimage and capture of Dejah Thoris. 7 days ago, after her audience with Zadaris, Dejah Thoris attempted to slip from the palace in the dead of night. Although I had not heard the outcome of her interview with Zadaris, I knew that something had occurred then to cause her the keenest mental agony, and when I discovered her creeping from the palace, I did not need to be told her destination. Hastily arousing a dozen of her most faithful guards, I explained my fears to them, and as one they enlisted with me to follow our beloved princess in her wanderings, even to the sacred Ish and the valley door. We came upon her but a short distance from the palace. With her was faithful Wula the hound, but none other. When we overtook her, she feigned anger, and ordered us back to the palace. But for once we disobeyed her, and when she found that we would not let her go upon the last long pilgrimage alone, she wept and embraced us, and together we went out into the night toward the south. The following day we came upon a herd of small thoats, and thereafter we were mounted and made good time. We traveled very fast and very far due south until the morning of the 5th day we sighted a great fleet of battleships sailing north. They saw us before we could seek shelter, and soon we were surrounded by a horde of black men. The princess's guard fought nobly to the end, but they were soon overcome and slain. Only Dejah Thoris and I were spared. When she realized that she was in the clutches of the black pirates, she attempted to take her own life, but one of the blacks tore her dagger from her, and then they bound us both so that we could not use our hands. The fleet continued north after capturing us. There were about 20 large battleships in all, besides a number of small swift cruisers. That evening one of the smaller cruisers that had been far in advance of the fleet returned with a prisoner, a young red woman, whom they had picked up in a range of hills under the very noses, they said, of a fleet of 3 red Martian battleships. From scraps of conversation which we overheard, it was evident that the black pirates were searching for a party of fugitives that had escaped them several days prior. That they considered the capture of the young woman important was evident from the long and earnest interview the commander of the fleet held with her when she was brought to him. Later she was bound and placed in the compartment with Dejah Thoris and myself. The new captive was a very beautiful girl. She told Dejah Thoris that many years ago she had taken the voluntary pilgrimage from the court of her father, the Jeddak of Parth. She was Thuvia, the princess of Parth. And then she asked Dejah Thoris who she might be, and when she heard she fell upon her knees and kissed Dejah Thoris's fettered hands, and told her that that very morning she had been with John Carter, Prince of Helium, and Carthoris, her son. Dejah Thoris could not believe her at first, but finally, when the girl had narrated all the strange adventures that had befallen her since she had met John Carter, and told her of the things John Carter and Carthoris and Exodar had narrated of their adventures in the land of the firstborn, Dejah Thoris knew that it could be none other than the Prince of Helium. For who, she said, upon all Barsoom other than John Carter could have done the deeds you tell of? And when Thuvia told Dejah Thoris of her love for John Carter, and his loyalty and devotion to the princess of his choice, Dejah Thoris broke down and wept, cursing Zadaris, and the cruel fate that had driven her from Helium but a few brief days before the return of her beloved lord. "I do not blame you for loving him, Thuvia," she said, "and that your affection for him is pure and sincere I can well believe from the candor of your avowal of it to me. The fleet continued north nearly to Helium, but last night they evidently realized that John Carter had indeed escaped them, and so they turned toward the south once more. Shortly thereafter a guard entered our compartment and dragged me to the deck. 'There is no place in the land of the firstborn for a green one,' he said, and with that he gave me a terrific shove that carried me toppling from the deck of the battleship. Evidently this seemed to him the easiest way of ridding the vessel of my presence and killing me at the same time. But a kind fate intervened, and by a miracle I escaped with but slight bruises. The ship was moving slowly at the time, and as I lunged overboard into the darkness beneath, I shuddered at the awful plunge I thought awaited me. For all day the fleet had sailed thousands of feet above the ground, but to my utter surprise I struck upon a soft mass of vegetation not 20 feet from the deck of the ship. In fact, the keel of the vessel must have been grazing the surface of the ground at the time. I lay all night where I had fallen, and the next morning brought an explanation of the fortunate coincidence that had saved me from a terrible death. As the sun rose I saw a vast panorama of sea bottom and distant hills lying far below me. I was upon the highest peak of a lofty range. The fleet, in the darkness of the preceding night, had barely grazed the crest of the hills, and in the brief span that they hovered close to the surface the black guard had pitched me, as he supposed, to my death. A few miles west of me was a great waterway. When I reached it I found to my delight that it belonged to Helium. Here a thoat was procured for me. The rest you know. For many minutes none spoke. Dejah Thoris in the clutches of the firstborn. I shuddered at the thought, but of a sudden the old fire of unconquerable self-confidence surged through me. I sprang to my feet, and with back-thrown shoulders and upraised sword took a solemn vow to reach, rescue, and revenge my princess. 100 swords leaped from 100 scabbards, and 100 fighting men sprang to the tabletop and pledged me their lives and fortunes to the expedition. Already my plans were formulated. I thanked each loyal friend, and leaving Carthoris to entertain them, withdrew to my own audience chamber with Cantos Can, Tars Tarkas, Exodar, and Horvastus. Here we discussed the details of our expedition until long after dark. Exodar was positive that Ishis would choose both Dejah Thoris and Thuvia to serve her for a year. "For that length of time at least they will be comparatively safe," he said, "and we will at least know where to look for them." In the matter of equipping a fleet to enter Omin, the details were left to Cantos Can and Exodar. The former agreed to take such vessels as we required into dock as rapidly as possible, where Exodar would direct their equipment with water propellers. For many years the Black had been in charge of the refitting of captured battleships that they might navigate Omin, and so was familiar with the construction of the propellers, housings, and the auxiliary gearing required. It was estimated that it would require 6 months to complete our preparations in view of the fact that the utmost secrecy must be maintained to keep the project from the ears of Zadaris. Cantos Can was confident now that the man's ambitions were fully aroused, and that nothing short of the title of Jeddak of Helium would satisfy him. "I doubt," he said, "if he would even welcome Dejah Thoris's return, for it would mean another nearer the throne than he. With you and Carthoris out of the way, there would be little to prevent him from assuming the title of Jeddak, and you may rest assured that so long as he is supreme here, there is no safety for either of you." "There is a way," cried Horvastus, "to thwart him effectually and forever." "What?" I asked. He smiled. "I shall whisper it here, but some day I shall stand upon the dome of the Temple of Reward and shout it to cheering multitudes below." "What do you mean?" asked Cantos Can. "John Carter, Jeddak of Helium," said Horvastus in a low voice. The eyes of my companions lighted, and grim smiles of pleasure and anticipation overspread their faces, as each eye turned toward me questioningly. But I shook my head. "No, my friends," I said, smiling. "Thank you, but it cannot be. Not yet, at least. When we know that Tardos Mors and Mors Kajak are gone to return no more, if I be here, then I shall join you all to see that the people of Helium are permitted to choose fairly their next Jeddak. Whom they choose may count upon the loyalty of my sword, nor shall I seek the honor for myself. Until then, Tardos Mors is Jeddak of Helium, and Zadaris his representative." "As you will, John Carter," said Horvastus, "but—" "What was that?" he whispered, pointing toward the window overlooking the gardens. The words were scarce out of his mouth ere he had sprung to the balcony without. "There he goes!" he cried excitedly. "The guards! Below there! The guards!" We were close behind him, and all saw the figure of a man run quickly across a little piece of sward and disappear in the shrubbery beyond. "He was on the balcony when I first saw him," cried Horvastus. "Quick! Let us follow him!" Together we ran to the gardens, but even though we scoured the grounds with the entire guard for hours, no trace could we find of the night marauder. "What do you make of it, Cantos Can?" asked Tartarchus. "A spy sent by Zadaris," he replied. "It was ever his way." "He will have something interesting to report to his masters, then," laughed Horvastus. "I hope he heard only our references to a new Jeddak," I said. "If he overheard our plans to rescue Dejah Thoris, it will mean civil war, for he will attempt to thwart us, and in that I will not be thwarted. There would I turn against Tardos Mors himself, were it necessary. If it throws all Helium into a bloody conflict, I shall go on with these plans to save my princess. Nothing shall stay me now short of death. And should I die, my friends, will you take oath to prosecute the search for her and bring her back in safety to her grandfather's court?" Upon the hilt of his sword each of them swore to do as I had asked. It was agreed that the battleships that were to be remodeled should be ordered to Hastur, another Heliometic city, far to the southwest. Cantos Can thought that the docks there, in addition to their regular work, would accommodate at least 6 battleships at a time. As he was commander-in-chief of the navy, it would be a simple matter for him to order the vessels there as they could be handled, and thereafter keep the remodeled fleet in remote parts of the empire until we should be ready to assemble it for the dash upon Omine. It was late that night before our conference broke up, but each man there had his particular duties outlined, and the details of the entire plan had been mapped out. Cantos Can and Exodar were to attend to the remodeling of the ships. Tartarchus was to get into communication with Thark and learn the sentiments of his people toward his return from Dor. If favorable, he was to return immediately to Thark and devote his time to the assembling of a great horde of green warriors whom it was our plan to send in transports directly to the Valley Dor and the Temple of Ishus, while the fleet entered Omine and destroyed the vessels of the firstborn. Upon Horvastus devolved the delicate mission of organizing a secret force of fighting men sworn to follow John Carter wherever he might lead. As we estimated that it would require over 1,000,000 men to man the 1,000 great battleships we intended to use on Omine, and the transports for the green men as well as the ships that were to convoy the transports, it was no trifling job that Horvastus had before him. After they had left, I bid Carthoris good night, for I was very tired, and going to my own apartments bathed and lay down upon my sleeping silks and furs for the first good night's sleep I had had an opportunity to look forward to since I had returned to Barsoom. But even now I was to be disappointed. How long I slept I do not know. When I awoke suddenly it was to find a half-dozen powerful men upon me, a gag already in my mouth, and a moment later my arms and legs securely bound. So quickly had they worked, and to such good purpose, that I was utterly beyond the power to resist them by the time I was fully awake. Never a word spoke they, and the gag effectually prevented me speaking. Silently they lifted me and bore me toward the door of my chamber. As they passed the window through which the farther moon was casting its brilliant beams, I saw that each of the party had his face swathed in layers of silk. I could not recognize one of them. When they had come into the corridor with me, they turned toward a secret panel in the wall which led to the passage that terminated in the pits beneath the palace. That any knew of this panel outside my own household I was doubtful. Yet the leader of the band did not hesitate a moment. He stepped directly to the panel, touched the concealed button, and as the door swung open he stood aside while his companions entered with me. Then he closed the panel behind him and followed us. Down through the passageways to the pits we went. The leader rapped upon it with the hilt of his sword. 3 quick, sharp blows, a pause, then 3 more, another pause, and then 2. A second later the wall swung in, and I was pushed within a brilliantly lighted chamber in which sat 3 richly trapped men. One of them turned toward me with a sardonic smile upon his thin, cruel lips. It was Zadaris. End of chapter 18.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 19. Black Despair. "Ah," said Zadaris, "to what kindly circumstance am I indebted for the pleasure of this unexpected visit from the Prince of Helium?" While he was speaking, one of my guards had removed the gag from my mouth, but I made no reply to Zadaris, simply standing there in silence with level gaze fixed upon the Jed of Zodanga, and I doubt not that my expression was colored by the contempt I felt for the man. The eyes of those within the chamber were fixed first upon me and then upon Zadaris, until finally a flush of anger crept slowly over his face. "You may go," he said to those who had brought me, and when only his two companions and ourselves were left in the chamber, he spoke to me again in a voice of ice, very slowly and deliberately, with many pauses, as though he would choose his words cautiously. "John Carter," he said, "by the edict of custom, by the law of our religion, and by the verdict of an impartial court, you are condemned to die. The people cannot save you. I alone may accomplish that. You are absolutely in my power to do with as I wish. I may kill you, or I may free you. And should I elect to kill you, none would be the wiser. Should you go free in Helium for a year, in accordance with the conditions of your reprieve, there is little fear that the people would ever insist upon the execution of the sentence imposed upon you. You may go free within 2 minutes upon one condition. Tardos Mors will never return to Helium, neither will Mors Kajak, nor Deja Thors. Helium must select a new Jeddak within the year. Zadaris would be Jeddak of Helium. Say that you will espouse my cause. This is the price of your freedom. I am done." I knew it was within the scope of Zadaris's cruel heart to destroy me, and if I were dead I could see little reason to doubt that he might easily become Jeddak of Helium. Free, I could prosecute the search for Deja Thors. Were I dead, my brave comrades might not be able to carry out our plans. So by refusing to accede to his request, it was quite probable that not only would I not prevent him from becoming Jeddak of Helium, but that I would be the means of sealing Deja Thors' fate, of consigning her, through my refusal, to the horrors of the arena of Ishis. For a moment I was perplexed, but for a moment only. The proud daughter of 1,000 Jeddaks would choose death to a dishonorable alliance such as this, nor could John Carter do less for Helium than his princess would do. Then I turned to Zadaris. "There can be no alliance," I said, "between a traitor to Helium and a prince of the house of Tardos Mors. I do not believe, Zadaris, that the great Jeddak is dead." Zadaris shrugged his shoulders. "It will not be long, John Carter," he said, "that your opinions will be of interest even to yourself, so make the best of them while you can. Zadaris will permit you in due time to reflect further upon the magnanimous offer he has made you. Into the silence and darkness of the pits you will enter upon your reflection this night with the knowledge that should you fail within a reasonable time to agree to the alternative which has been offered you, never shall you emerge from the darkness and the silence again, nor shall you know at what minute the hand will reach out through the darkness and the silence with the keen dagger that shall rob you of your last chance to win again the warmth and the freedom and the joyousness of the outer world." Zadaris clapped his hands as he ceased speaking. The guards returned. Zadaris waved his hand in my direction. "To the pits," he said. That was all. 4 men accompanied me from the chamber, and with a radium handlight to illume the way, escorted me through seemingly interminable tunnels, down, ever down beneath the city of Helium. At length they halted within a fair-sized chamber. There were rings set in the rocky walls. To them chains were fastened, and at the ends of many of the chains were human skeletons. One of these they kicked aside, and unlocking the huge padlock that had held a chain about what had once been a human ankle, they snapped the iron band about my own leg. Then they left me, taking the light with them. Utter darkness prevailed. For a few minutes I could hear the clanking of accoutrements, but even this grew fainter and fainter until at last the silence was as complete as the darkness. I was alone with my gruesome companions, with the bones of dead men whose fate was likely but the index of my own. How long I stood listening in the darkness I do not know, but the silence was unbroken, and at last I sunk to the hard floor of my prison, where, leaning my head against the stony wall, I slept. It must have been several hours later that I awakened to find a young man standing before me. In one hand he bore a light, in the other a receptacle containing a gruel-like mixture, the common prison fare of Barsoom. "Zadar sends you greetings," said the young man, "and commands me to inform you that though he is fully advised of the plot to make you Jeddak of Helim, he is, however, not inclined to withdraw the offer which he has made you. To gain your freedom, you have but to request me to advise Zadars that you accept the terms of his proposition." I but shook my head. The youth said no more, and after placing the food upon the floor at my side, returned up the corridor, taking the light with him. Twice a day for many days this youth came to my cell with food, and ever the same greetings from Zadars. For a long time I tried to engage him in conversation upon other matters, but he would not talk, and so at length I desisted. For months I sought to devise methods to inform Carthoris of my whereabouts. For months I scraped and scraped upon a single link of the massive chain which held me, hoping eventually to wear it through, that I might follow the youth back through the winding tunnels to a point where I could make a break for liberty. I was beside myself with anxiety for knowledge of the progress of the expedition which was to rescue Dejathoris. I felt that Carthoris would not let the matter drop, were he free to act, but in so far as I knew, he also might be a prisoner in Zadaris's pits. That Zadaris's spy had overheard our conversation relative to the selection of a new Jeddak, I knew, and scarcely a half-dozen minutes prior we had discussed the details of the plan to rescue Dejathoris. The chances were that that matter, too, was well known to him. Carthoris, Cantos Can, Tarstarchus, Horvastus, and Exeter might even now be the victims of Zadaris's assassins, or else his prisoners. I determined to make at least one more effort to learn something, and to this end I adopted strategy when next the youth came to my cell. I had noticed that he was a handsome fellow, about the size and age of Carthoris, and I had also noticed that his shabby trappings but illy comported with his dignified and noble bearing. It was with these observations as a basis that I opened my negotiations with him upon his next subsequent visit. "You have been very kind to me during my imprisonment here," I said to him, "and as I feel that I have at best but a very short time to live, I wish, ere it is too late, to furnish substantial testimony of my appreciation of all that you have done to render my imprisonment bearable. Promptly you have brought my food each day, seeing that it was pure and of sufficient quantity. Never by word or deed have you attempted to take advantage of my defenseless condition to insult or torture me. You have been uniformly courteous and considerate. It is this more than any other thing which prompts my feeling of gratitude and my desire to give you some slight token of it. In the guard-room of my palace are many fine trappings. Go thou there and select the harness which most pleases you. It shall be yours. All I ask is that you wear it, that I may know that my wish has been realized. Tell me that you will do it." The boy's eyes had lighted with pleasure as I spoke, and I saw him glance from his rusty trappings to the magnificence of my own. For a moment he stood in thought before he spoke, and for that moment my heart fairly ceased beating. So much for me there was which hung upon the substance of his answer. And I went to the palace of the Prince of Helim with any such demand, they would laugh at me, and into the bargain would more than likely throw me head foremost into the avenue. No, it cannot be, though I thank you for the offer. Why, if Zadaris even dreamed that I contemplated such a thing, he would have my heart cut out of me. "There could be no harm in it, my boy," I urged. "By night you may go to my palace with a note from me to Carthoris, my son. You may read the note before you deliver it, that you may know that it contains nothing harmful to Zadaris. My son will be discreet, and so none but us three need know. It is very simple, and such a harmless act that it could be condemned by no one." Again he stood silently in deep thought. "And there is a jeweled short sword which I took from the body of a northern Jeddak. When you get the harness, see that Carthoris gives you that also. With it and the harness, which you may select, there will be no more handsomely accoutred warrior in all Zodanga. Bring writing materials when you come next to my cell, and within a few hours we shall see you garbed in a style befitting your birth and carriage." Still in thought, and without speaking, he turned and left me. I could not guess what his decision might be, and for hours I sat fretting over the outcome of the matter. If he accepted a message to Carthoris, it would mean to me that Carthoris still lived and was free. If the youth returned wearing the harness and the sword, I would know that Carthoris had received my note, and that he knew that I still lived. That the bearer of the note was a Zodangan would be sufficient to explain to Carthoris that I was a prisoner of Zadaris. It was with feelings of excited expectancy which I could scarce hide that I heard the youth's approach upon the occasion of his next regular visit. I did not speak beyond my accustomed greeting of him. As he placed the food upon the floor by my side, he also deposited writing materials at the same time. My heart fairly bounded for joy. I had won my point. For a moment I looked at the materials in feigned surprise, but soon I permitted an expression of dawning comprehension to come into my face, and then, picking them up, I penned a brief order to Carthoris to deliver to Parthak a harness of his selection and the short sword which I described. That was all, but it meant everything to me and to Carthoris. I laid the note open upon the floor. Parthak picked it up, and without a word left me. As nearly as I could estimate, I had at this time been in the pits for 300 days. If anything was to be done to save Dejah Thoris, it must be done quickly, for, were she not already dead, her end must soon come, since those whom Ishus chose lived but a single year. The next time I heard approaching footsteps, I could scarce await to see if Parthak wore the harness and the sword. But judge, if you can, my chagrin and disappointment when I saw that he who bore my food was not Parthak. "What has become of Parthak?" I asked, but the fellow would not answer, and as soon as he had deposited my food, turned and retraced his steps to the world above. Days came and went, and still my new jailer continued his duties, nor would he ever speak a word to me, either in reply to the simplest question or of his own initiative. I could only speculate on the cause of Parthak's removal, but that it was connected in some way directly with the note I had given him was most apparent to me. After all my rejoicing, I was no better off than before, for now I did not even know that Carthoris lived, for if Parthak had wished to raise himself in the estimation of Zadaris, he would have permitted me to go on precisely as I did, so that he could carry my note to his master, in proof of his own loyalty and devotion. 30 days had passed since I had given the youth the note. 330 days had passed since my incarceration. As closely as I could figure, there remained a bare 30 days ere Dejah Thoris would be ordered to the arena for the rites of Ishus. As the terrible picture forced itself vividly across my imagination, I buried my face in my arms, and only with the greatest difficulty was it that I repressed the tears that welled to my eyes despite my every effort. To think of that beautiful creature torn and rended by the cruel fangs of the hideous white apes, it was unthinkable. Such a horrid fact could not be, and yet my reason told me that within 30 days my incomparable princess would be fought over in the arena of the firstborn by those very wild beasts, that her bleeding corpse would be dragged through the dirt and the dust, until at last a part of it would be rescued to be served as food upon the tables of the black nobles. I think that I should have gone crazy but for the sound of my approaching jailer. It distracted my attention from the terrible thoughts that had been occupying my entire mind. Now a new and grim determination came to me. I would make one superhuman effort to escape, kill my jailer by a ruse, and trust to fate to lead me to the outer world in safety. With the thought came instant action. I threw myself upon the floor of my cell close by the wall, in a strained and distorted posture, as though I were dead after a struggle or convulsions. When he should stoop over me, I had but to grasp his throat with one hand and strike him a terrific blow with the slack of my chain, which I gripped firmly in my right hand for the purpose. Nearer and nearer came the doomed man. Now I heard him halt before me. There was a muttered exclamation, and then a step as he came to my side. I felt him kneel beside me. My grip tightened upon the chain. He leaned close to me. I must open my eyes to find his throat, grasp it, and strike one mighty final blow, all at the same instant. The thing worked just as I had planned. So brief was the interval between the opening of my eyes and the fall of the chain that I could not check it, though in that minute interval I recognized the face so close to mine as that of my son, Carthoris. God, what cruel and malign fate had worked to such a frightful end! What devious chain of circumstances had led my boy to my side at this one particular minute of our lives, when I could strike him down and kill him, in ignorance of his identity? A benign though tardy providence blurred my vision and my mind as I sank into unconsciousness across the lifeless body of my only son. When I regained consciousness, it was to feel a cool, firm hand pressed upon my forehead. For an instant I did not open my eyes. I was endeavoring to gather the loose ends of many thoughts and memories which flitted elusively through my tired and overwrought brain. At length came the cruel recollection of the thing that I had done in my last conscious act, and then I dared not to open my eyes for fear of what I should see lying beside me. I wondered who it could be who ministered to me. Carthoris must have had a companion whom I had not seen. Well, I must face the inevitable some time, so why not now? And with a sigh I opened my eyes. Leaning over me was Carthoris, a great bruise upon his forehead where the chain had struck, but alive. Thank God, alive. There was no one with him. Reaching out my arms, I took my boy within them, and if ever there arose from any planet a fervent prayer of gratitude, it was there beneath the crust of dying Mars, as I thanked the eternal mystery for my son's life. The brief instant in which I had seen and recognized Carthoris before the chain fell must have been ample to check the force of the blow. He told me that he had lain unconscious for a time. How long he did not know. "How came you here at all?" I asked, mystified that he had found me without a guide. "It was by your wit in appraising me of your existence and imprisonment through the youth Parthak. Until he came for his harness and his sword, we had thought you dead. When I had read your note, I did as you had bid, giving Parthak his choice of the harness in the guardroom, and later bringing the jeweled short sword to him. But the minute that I had fulfilled the promise you evidently had made him, my obligation to him ceased. Then I commenced to question him, but he would give me no information as to your whereabouts. He was intensely loyal to Zadaris. Finally, I gave him a fair choice between freedom and the pits beneath the palace. The price of freedom to be full information as to where you were imprisoned and directions which would lead us to you. But still he maintained his stubborn partisanship. Despairing, I had him removed to the pits, where he still is. No threats of torture or death, no bribes, however fabulous, would move him. His only reply to all our importunities was that whenever Parthak died, were it tomorrow or 1,000 years hence, no man could truly say a traitor is gone to his deserts. Finally, Edgar, who is a fiend of subtle craftiness, evolved a plan whereby we might worm the information from him. And so I caused Horvastus to be harnessed in the metal of a Zodangan soldier, and chained in Parthak's cell beside him. For 15 days the noble Horvastus has languished in the darkness of the pits, but not in vain. Little by little he won the confidence and friendship of the Zodangan, until only today Parthak, thinking that he was speaking not only to a countryman, but to a dear friend, revealed to Horvastus the exact cell in which you lay. It took me but a short time to locate the plans of the pits of helium among thy official papers. To come to you, though, was a trifle more difficult matter. As you know, while all the pits beneath the city are connected, there are but single entrances from those beneath each section and its neighbor, and that at the upper level just underneath the ground. Of course, these openings, which lead from contiguous pits to those beneath government buildings, are always guarded, and so, while I easily came to the entrance to the pits beneath the palace which Zadaris is occupying, I found there a Zodangan soldier on guard. There I left him when I had gone by, but his soul was no longer with him. "And here I am, just in time to be nearly killed by you," he ended, laughing. As he talked, Carthoris had been working at the lock, which held my fetters, and now, with an exclamation of pleasure, he dropped the end of the chain to the floor, and I stood up once more, freed from the galling irons I had chafed in for almost a year. He had brought a long sword and a dagger for me, and thus armed we set out upon the return journey to my palace. At the point where we left the pits of Zadaris, we found the body of the guard Carthoris had slain. It had not yet been discovered, and, in order to still further delay search and mystify the Jed's people, we carried the body with us for a short distance, hiding it in a tiny cell off the main corridor of the pits beneath an adjoining estate. Some half-hour later we came to the pits beneath our own palace, and soon thereafter emerged into the audience chamber itself, where we found Cantos Can, Tars Tarkas, Horvastus, and Edgar awaiting us most impatiently. No time was lost in fruitless recounting of my imprisonment. What I desired to know was how well the plans we had laid nearly a year ago had been carried out. "It has taken much longer than we had expected," replied Cantos Can. "The fact that we were compelled to maintain utter secrecy has handicapped us terribly. Zadaras's spies are everywhere. Yet to the best of my knowledge no word of our real plans has reached the villain's ear. Tonight there lies about the great docks at Hastur a fleet of 1,000 of the mightiest battleships that ever sailed above Barsoom, and each equipped to navigate the air of Omin and the waters of Omin itself. Upon each battleship there are 5 10-man cruisers, and 10 5-man scouts, and 100 1-man scouts, in all 116,000 craft fitted with both air and water propellers. At Thark lie the transport for the green warriors of Tars Tarkas, 900 large troop ships, and with them their convoys. 7 days ago all was in readiness, but we waited in the hope that by so doing your rescue might be encompassed in time for you to command the expedition. It is well we waited, my prince." "How is it, Tars Tarkas," I asked, "that the men of Thark take not the accustomed action against one who returns from the bosom of Ish?" "They sent a council of 50 chieftains to talk with me here," replied the Thark. "We are a just people, and when I had told them the entire story they were as one man in agreeing that their action toward me would be guided by the action of Helium toward John Carter. In the meantime, at their request, I was to resume my throne as Jeddak of Thark, that I might negotiate with neighboring hordes of warriors to compose the land forces of the expedition. I have done that which I agreed. 250,000 fighting men, gathered from the ice cap at the north to the ice cap at the south, and representing 1,000 different communities from 100 wild and warlike hordes, fill the great city of Thark tonight. They are ready to sail for the land of the firstborn when I give the word, and fight there until I bid them stop. All they ask is the loot they take and transportation to their own territories when the fighting and the looting are over. I am done." "And thou, Horvastus," I asked, "what has been thy success?" "1,000,000 veteran fighting men from Helium's thin waterways man the battleships, the transports, and the convoys," he replied. "Each is sworn to loyalty and secrecy, nor were enough recruited from a single district to cause suspicion." "Good!" I cried. "Each has done his duty, and now, Cantos Can, may we not repair at once to Hastur, and get under way before tomorrow's sun?" "We should lose no time, Prince," replied Cantos Can. "Already the people of Hastur are questioning the purpose of so great a fleet fully manned with fighting men. I wonder much that word of it has not before reached Zadaras. A cruiser awaits above at your own dock. Let us leave it—" A fusillade of shots from the palace gardens just without cut short his further words. Together we rushed to the balcony in time to see a dozen members of my palace guard disappear in the shadows of some distant shrubbery as in pursuit of one who fled. Directly beneath us upon the scarlet sward a handful of guardsmen were stooping above a still and prostrate form. While we watched they lifted the figure in their arms, and at my command bore it to the audience chamber where we had been in council. When they stretched the body at our feet we saw that it was that of a red man in the prime of life. His metal was plain, such as common soldiers wear, or those who wish to conceal their identity. "Another of Zadaras's spies," said Horvastus. "So it would seem," I replied, and then to the guard, "You may remove the body." "Wait," said Exodar. "If you will, Prince, ask that a cloth and a little thoat oil be brought." I nodded to one of the soldiers who left the chamber, returning presently with the things that Exodar had requested. The black kneeled beside the body, and dipping a corner of the cloth in the thoat oil, rubbed for a moment on the dead face before him. Then he turned to me with a smile, pointing to his work. I looked and saw that where Exodar had applied the thoat oil the face was white as mine, and then Exodar seized the black hair of the corpse and with a sudden wrench tore it all away, revealing a hairless pate beneath. Guardsmen and nobles pressed close about the silent witness upon the marble floor. Many were the exclamations of astonishment and questioning wonder as Exodar's axe confirmed the suspicions which he had held. "A Thurn," whispered Tars Tarkas. "Worse than that, I fear," replied Exodar. "But let us see." With that he drew his dagger and cut open a locked pouch which had dangled from the Thurn's harness, and from it he brought forth a circlet of gold set with a large gem. It was the mate to that which I had taken from Sator Throg. "He was a holy Thurn," said Exodar. "Fortunate indeed it is for us that he did not escape." The officer of the guard entered the chamber at this juncture. "My prince," he said, I have to report that this fellow's companion escaped us. I think that it was with the connivance of one or more of the men at the gate. I have ordered them all under arrest." Edgar handed him the thoat oil and cloth. "With this you may discover the spy among you," he said. I at once ordered a secret search within the city, for every Martian noble maintains a secret service of his own. A half-hour later the officer of the guard came again to report. This time it was to confirm our worst fears. Half the guards at the gate that night had been Therns disguised as red men. "Come," I cried, "we must lose no time. On to Hastur at once. Should the Therns attempt to check us at the southern verge of the ice cap, it may result in the wrecking of all our plans and the total destruction of the expedition." 10 minutes later we were speeding through the night toward Hastur, prepared to strike the first blow for the preservation of Dejah Thoris. End of chapter 19.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 20. The Air Battle. 2 hours after leaving my palace at Helium, or about midnight, Cantos Can, Exidar, and I arrived at Hastur. Carthoris, Tarstarchus, and Horvastus had gone directly to Thark upon another cruiser. The transports were to get under way immediately and move slowly south. The fleet of battleships would overtake them on the morning of the second day. At Hastur we found all in readiness, and so perfectly had Cantos Can planned every detail of the campaign that within 10 minutes of our arrival the first of the fleet had soared aloft from its dock, and thereafter, at the rate of 1 a second, the great ships floated gracefully out into the night to form a long, thin line which stretched for miles toward the south. It was not until after we had entered the cabin of Cantos Can that I thought to ask the date, for up to now I was not positive how long I had lain in the pits of Zadaris. When Cantos Can told me, I realized with a pang of dismay that I had misreckoned the time while I lay in the utter darkness of my cell. 365 days had passed. It was too late to save Dejah Thoris. The expedition was no longer one of rescue but of revenge. I did not remind Cantos Can of the terrible fact that ere we could hope to enter the temple of Ishis, the princess of Helium would be no more. In so far as I knew, she might be already dead, for I did not know the exact date on which she first viewed Ishis. What now the value of burdening my friends with my added personal sorrows? They had shared quite enough of them with me in the past. Hereafter I would keep my grief to myself, and so I said nothing to any other of the fact that we were too late. The expedition could yet do much if it could but teach the people of Barsoom the facts of the cruel deception that had been worked upon them for countless ages, and thus save thousands each year from the horrid fate that awaited them at the conclusion of the voluntary pilgrimage. If it could open to the red man the fair valley door, it would have accomplished much, and in the land of lost souls between the mountains of Orts and the ice barrier were many broad acres that needed no irrigation to bear rich harvests. Here at the bottom of a dying world was the only naturally productive area upon its surface. Here alone were dews and rains. Here alone was an open sea. Here was water in plenty, and all this was but the stomping ground of fierce brutes, and from its beauteous and fertile expanse the wicked remnants of two once mighty races barred all the other millions of Barsoom. Could I but succeed in once breaking down the barrier of religious superstition which had kept the red races from this El Dorado, it would be a fitting memorial to the immortal virtues of my princess. I should have again served Barsoom, and Dejah Thoris's martyrdom would not have been in vain. On the morning of the second day we raised the great fleet of transports and their consorts at the first flood of dawn, and soon were near enough to exchange signals. I may mention here that radio aerograms are seldom if ever used in wartime, or for the transmission of secret dispatches at any time, for as often as one nation discovers a new cipher or invents a new instrument for wireless purposes, its neighbors bend every effort until they are able to intercept and translate the message. For so long a time has this gone on that practically every possibility of wireless communication has been exhausted, and no nation dares transmit dispatches of importance in this way. Tarkas reported all well with the transports. The battleships passed through to take an advanced position, and the combined fleets moved slowly over the ice cap, hugging the surface closely to prevent detection by the Therns, whose land we were approaching. Far in advance of all, a thin line of one-man air scouts protected us from surprise, and on either side they flanked us, while a smaller number brought up the rear some 20 miles behind the transports. In this formation we had progressed toward the entrance to Omin for several hours, when one of our scouts returned from the front to report that a cone-like summit of the entrance was in sight. At almost the same instant another scout from the left flank came racing toward the flagship. His very speed bespoke the importance of his information. Cantos Can and I awaited him upon the little forward deck which corresponds with the bridge of earthly battleships. Scarcely had his tiny flyer come to rest upon the broad landing deck of the flagship ere he was bounding up the stairway to the deck where we stood. "A great fleet of battleships south-southeast, my prince," he cried. "There must be several thousands, and they are bearing down directly upon us." "The Thern spies were not in the palace of John Carter for nothing," said Cantos Can to me. "Your orders, prince." "Dispatch 10 battleships to guard the entrance to Omin, with orders to let no hostile enter or leave the shaft. That will bottle up the great fleet of the firstborn. Form the balance of the battleships into a great V with the apex pointing directly south-southeast. Order the transports, surrounded by their convoys, to follow closely in the wake of the battleships, until the point of the V has entered the enemy's line. Then the V must open outward at the apex. The battleships of each leg engage the enemy fiercely and drive him back to form a lane through his line, into which the transports with their convoys must race at top speed, that they may gain a position above the temples and gardens of the Therns. Here let them land and teach the holy Therns such a lesson in ferocious warfare as they will not forget for countless ages. It had not been my intention to be distracted from the main issue of the campaign, but we must settle this attack with the Therns once and for all, or there will be no peace for us while our fleet remains near Dor, and our chances of ever returning to the outer world will be greatly minimized." Cantos Can saluted and turned to deliver my instructions to his waiting aides. In an incredibly short space of time the formation of the battleships changed in accordance with my commands. The 10 that were to guard the way to Omin were speeding toward their destination, and the troop ships and convoys were closing up in preparation for the spurt through the lane. The order "full speed ahead" was given. The fleet sprang through the air like coursing greyhounds, and in another moment the ships of the enemy were in full view. They formed a ragged line as far as the eye could reach in either direction, and about 3 ships deep. So sudden was our onslaught that they had no time to prepare for it. It was as unexpected as lightning from a clear sky. Every phase of my plan worked splendidly. Our huge ships mowed their way entirely through the line of Thern battlecraft. Then the V opened up, and a broad lane appeared through which the transports leaped toward the temples of the Therns, which could now be plainly seen glistening in the sunlight. By the time the Therns had rallied from the attack, 100,000 green warriors were already pouring through their courts and gardens, while 150,000 others leaned from low-swinging transports to direct their almost uncanny marksmanship upon the Thern soldiery that manned the ramparts, or attempted to defend the temples. Now the 2 great fleets closed in a titanic struggle far above the fiendish din of battle in the gorgeous gardens of the Therns. Slowly the 2 lines of Helium's battleships joined their ends, and then commenced the circling within the line of the enemy, which is so marked a characteristic of Barsoomian naval warfare. Around and around in each other's tracks moved the ships under Cantos Can, until at length they formed nearly a perfect circle. By this time they were moving at high speed, so that they presented a difficult target for the enemy. Broadside after broadside they delivered as each vessel came in line with the ships of the Therns. The latter attempted to rush in and break up the formation, but it was like stopping a buzzsaw with the bare hand. From my position on the deck beside Cantos Can, I saw ship after ship of the enemy take the awful sickening dive which proclaims its total destruction. Slowly we maneuvered our circle of death until we hung above the gardens where our green warriors were engaged. The order was passed down for them to embark. Then they rose slowly to a position within the center of the circle. In the meantime the Therns' fire had practically ceased. They had had enough of us, and were only too glad to let us go on our way in peace. But our escape was not to be encompassed with such ease, for scarcely had we gotten under way once more in the direction of the entrance to Omine than we saw far to the north a great black line topping the horizon. It could be nothing other than a fleet of war, whose or whither bound we could not even conjecture. When they had come close enough to make us out at all, Cantos Can's operator received a radio aerogram, which he immediately handed to my companion. He read the thing and handed it to me. Cantos Can, it read, surrender in the name of the Jeddak of Helium, for you cannot escape, and it was signed Zadaris. The Therns must have caught and translated the message almost as soon as did we, for they immediately renewed hostilities when they realized that we were soon to be set upon by other enemies. Before Zadaris had approached near enough to fire a shot, we were again hotly engaged with the Thern fleet, and as soon as he drew near he too commenced to pour a terrific fusillade of heavy shot into us. Ship after ship reeled and staggered into uselessness beneath the pitiless fire that we were undergoing. The thing could not last much longer. I ordered the transports to descend again into the gardens of the Therns. Wreak your vengeance to the utmost, was my message to the Green Allies, for by night there will be none left to avenge your wrongs. Presently I saw the 10 battleships that had been ordered to hold the shaft of Omine. They were returning at full speed, firing their stern batteries almost continuously. There could be but one explanation. They were being pursued by another hostile fleet. Well, the situation could be no worse. The expedition already was doomed. No man that had embarked upon it would return across that dreary ice cap. How I wished that I might face Zadaris with my longsword for just an instant before I died. It was he who had caused our failure. As I watched the oncoming 10, I saw their pursuers race swiftly into sight. It was another great fleet. For a moment I could not believe my eyes, but finally I was forced to admit that the most fatal calamity had overtaken the expedition, for the fleet I saw was none other than the fleet of the firstborn, that should have been safely bottled up in Omine. What a series of misfortunes and disasters! What awful fate hovered over me, that I should have been so terribly thwarted at every angle of my search for my lost love. Could it be possible that the curse of Ishus was upon me, that there was, indeed, some malign divinity in that hideous carcass? I would not believe it, and throwing back my shoulders I ran to the deck below to join my men in repelling boarders from one of the Thern craft that had grappled us broadside. In the wild lust of hand-to-hand combat my old dauntless hopefulness returned, and as Thern after Thern went down beneath my blade I could almost feel that we should win success in the end, even from apparent failure. My presence among the men so greatly inspirited them that they fell upon the luckless wights with such terrible ferocity that within a few moments we had turned the tables upon them, and a second later, as we swarmed their own decks, I had the satisfaction of seeing their commander take the long leap from the bows of his vessel in token of surrender and defeat. Then I joined Cantos Can. He had been watching what had taken place on the deck below, and it seemed to have given him a new thought. Immediately he passed an order to one of his officers, and presently the colors of the Prince of Helium broke from every point of the flagship. A great cheer arose from the men of our own ship, a cheer that was taken up by every other vessel of our expedition, as they in turn broke my colors from their upper works. Then Cantos Can sprang his coup. A signal legible to every sailor of all the fleets engaged in that fierce struggle was strung aloft upon the flagship. Men of Helium, for the Prince of Helium against all his enemies, it read. Presently my colors broke from one of Zadaris' ships, then from another, and another. On some we could see fierce battles waging between the Zodangan soldiery and the Heliumetic crews, but eventually the colors of the Prince of Helium floated above every ship that had followed Zadaris upon our trail. Only his flagship flew them not. Zadaris had brought 5,000 ships. The sky was black with the 3 enormous fleets. It was Helium against the field now, and the fight had settled to countless individual duels. There could be little or no maneuvering of fleets in that crowded, fire-split sky. Zadaris' flagship was close to my own. I could see the thin features of the man from where I stood. His Zodangan crew was pouring broadside after broadside into us, and we were returning their fire with equal ferocity. Closer and closer came the two vessels until but a few yards intervened. Grapplers and boarders lined the contiguous rails of each. We were preparing for the death struggle with our hated enemy. There was but a yard between the two mighty ships as the first grappling irons were hurled. I rushed to the deck to be with my men as they boarded. Just as the vessels came together with a slight shock, I forced my way through the lines and was the first to spring to the deck of Zadarus' ship. After me poured a yelling, cheering, cursing throng of Helium's best fighting men. Nothing could withstand them in the fever of battle lust which enthralled them. Down went the Zodangans before that surging tide of war, and as my men cleared the lower decks, I sprang to the forward deck where stood Zadarus. "You are my prisoner, Zadarus," I cried. "Yield, and you shall have quarter." For a moment I could not tell whether he contemplated acceding to my demand or facing me with drawn sword. For an instant he stood hesitating, and then throwing down his arms, he turned and rushed to the opposite side of the deck. Before I could overtake him, he had sprung to the rail and hurled himself head foremost into the awful depths below. And thus came Zadarus, Jed of Zodanga, to his end. On and on went that strange battle. The Therns and Blacks had not combined against us. Wherever Thern ship met ship of the firstborn was a battle royale, and in this I thought I saw our salvation. Wherever messages could be passed between us that could not be intercepted by our enemies, I passed the word that all our vessels were to withdraw from the fight as rapidly as possible, taking a position to the west and south of the combatants. I also sent an air scout to the fighting green men in the gardens below to re-embark to the transports and to join us. My commanders were further instructed than when engaged with an enemy to draw him as rapidly as possible toward a ship of his hereditary foeman, and by careful maneuvering to force the two to engage, thus leaving himself free to withdraw. This stratagem worked to perfection, and just before the sun went down I had the satisfaction of seeing all that was left of my once mighty fleet gathered nearly 20 miles southwest of the still terrific battle between the blacks and whites. I now transferred Exeter to another battleship and sent him with all the transports and 5,000 battleships directly overhead to the temple of Ishus. Carthoris and I, with Cantos Can, took the remaining ships and headed for the entrance to Omine. Our plan now was to attempt to make a combined assault upon Ishus at dawn of the following day. Tars Tarkas with his green warriors and Horvastus with the red men, guided by Exeter, were to land within the garden of Ishus or the surrounding plains, while Carthoris, Cantos Can, and I were to lead our smaller force from the Sea of Omine through the pits beneath the temple, which Carthoris knew so well. I now learned for the first time the cause of my 10 ships' retreat from the mouth of the shaft. It seemed that when they had come upon the shaft, the navy of the firstborn were already issuing from its mouth. Fully 20 vessels had emerged, and though they gave battle immediately in an effort to stem the tide that rolled from the black pit, the odds against them were too great, and they were forced to flee. With great caution we approached the shaft, under cover of darkness. At a distance of several miles I caused the fleet to be halted, and from there Carthoris went ahead alone upon a one-man flyer to reconnoitre. In perhaps half an hour he returned to report that there was no sign of a patrol boat or of the enemy in any form, and so we moved swiftly and noiselessly forward once more toward Omine. At the mouth of the shaft we stopped again for a moment for all the vessels to reach their previously appointed stations. Then with the flagship I dropped quickly into the black depths, while one by one the other vessels followed me in quick succession. We had decided to stake all on the chance that we would be able to reach the temple by the subterranean way, and so we left no guard of vessels at the shaft's mouth. Nor would it have profited us any to have done so, for we did not have sufficient force all told to have withstood the vast navy of the firstborn had they returned to engage us. For the safety of our entrance upon Omine we depended largely upon the very boldness of it, believing that it would be some little time before the firstborn on guard there would realize that it was an enemy and not their own returning fleet that was entering the vault of the buried sea. And such proved to be the case. In fact, 400 of my fleet of 500 rested safely upon the bosom of Omine before the first shot was fired. The battle was short and hot, but there could have been but one outcome, for the firstborn, in the carelessness of fancied security, had left but a handful of ancient and obsolete hulks to guard their mighty harbor. It was at Carthoris' suggestion that we landed our prisoners under guard upon a couple of the larger islands, and then towed the ships of the firstborn to the shaft, where we managed to wedge a number of them securely in the interior of the great well. Then we turned on the buoyancy rays in the balance of them, and let them rise by themselves to further block the passage to Omine as they came into contact with the vessels already lodged there. We now felt that it would be some time at least before the returning firstborn could reach the surface of Omine, and that we would have ample opportunity to make for the subterranean passages which lead to Ischus. One of the first steps I took was to hasten personally with a good-sized force to the island of the submarine, which I took without resistance on the part of the small guard there. I found the submarine in its pool, and at once placed a strong guard upon it and the island, where I remained to wait the coming of Carthoris and the others. Among the prisoners was Yersted, commander of the submarine. He recognized me from the 3 trips that I had taken with him during my captivity among the firstborn. "How does it seem," I asked him, "to have the tables turned, to be prisoner of your erstwhile captive?" He smiled a very grim smile pregnant with hidden meaning. "It will not be for long, John Carter," he replied. "We have been expecting you, and we are prepared." "So it would appear," I answered, "for you were all ready to become my prisoners with scarce a blow struck on either side." "The fleet must have missed you," he said, "but it will return to Omine, and then that will be a very different matter for John Carter." "I do not know that the fleet has missed me as yet," I said, but of course he did not grasp my meaning, and only looked puzzled. "Many prisoners travel to Ischus in your grim craft, Yersted?" I asked. "Very many," he assented. "Might you remember one whom men called Dejathoris? Well indeed for her great beauty, and then too for the fact that she was wife to the first mortal that ever escaped from Ischus through all the countless ages of her godhood. And the way that Ischus remembers her best as the wife of one and the mother of another who raised their hands against the goddess of life eternal." I shuddered for fear of the cowardly revenge that I knew Ischus might have taken upon the innocent Dejathoris for the sacrilege of her son and her husband. "And where is Dejathoris now?" I asked, knowing that he would say the words I most dreaded. But yet I loved her so that I could not refrain from hearing even the worst about her fate, so that it fell from the lips of one who had seen her but recently. It was to me as though it brought her closer to me. "Yesterday the monthly rites of Ischus were held," replied Yersted, "and I saw her then sitting in her accustomed place at the foot of Ischus." "What?" I cried. "She is not dead, then?" "Why, no," replied the black. "It has been no year since she gazed upon the divine glory of the radiant face of—" "No year?" I interrupted. "Why, no," insisted Yersted. "It could not have been upward of 370 or 80 days." A great light burst upon me. How stupid I had been! I could scarcely retain an outward exhibition of my great joy. Why had I forgotten the great difference in the length of Martian and earthly years? The 10 earth years I had spent upon Barsoom had encompassed but 5 years and 96 days of Martian time, whose days are 41 minutes longer than ours, and whose years number 687 days. "I'm in time! I'm in time!" The words surged through my brain again and again, until at last I must have voiced them audibly, for Yersted shook his head. "In time to save your princess?" he asked, and then, without waiting for my reply, "No, John Carter, Ischus will not give up her own. She knows that you are coming, and ere ever a vandal foot is set within the precincts of the temple of Ischus, if such a calamity should befall, Dejathoris will be put away forever from the last faint hope of rescue." "You mean that she will be killed merely to thwart me?" I asked. "Not that, other than as a last resort," he replied. "Hast ever heard of the Temple of the Sun? It is there that they will put her. It lies far within the inner court of the Temple of Ischus, a little temple that rises a thin spire far above the spires and minarets of the great temple that surrounds it. Beneath it, in the ground, there lies the main body of the temple, consisting in 687 circular chambers, one below another. To each chamber a single corridor leads through solid rock from the pits of Ischus. As the entire Temple of the Sun revolves once with each revolution of Barsoom about the sun, but once each year does the entrance to each separate chamber come opposite the mouth of the corridor which forms its only link to the world without. Here Ischus puts those who displease her, but whom she does not care to execute forthwith, or to punish a noble of the firstborn, she may cause him to be placed within a chamber of the temple of the sun for a year. Ofttimes she imprisons an executioner with the condemned, that death may come in a certain horrible form upon a given day. Or again, but enough food is deposited in the chamber to sustain life but the number of days that Isis has allotted for mental anguish. Thus will Dejathoris die, and her fate will be sealed by the first alien foot that crosses the threshold of Isis. So I was to be thwarted in the end. Although I had performed the miraculous and come within a few short moments of my divine princess, yet was I as far from her as when I stood upon the banks of the Hudson, 48 million miles away. End of chapter 20.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 21. Through Flood and Flame. Yersted's information convinced me that there was no time to be lost. I must reach the temple of Isis secretly before the forces under Tarkas assaulted at dawn. Once within its hated walls, I was positive that I could overcome the guards of Isis and bear away my princess, for at my back I would have a force ample for the occasion. No sooner had Carthoris and the others joined me than we commenced the transportation of our men through the submerged passage to the mouth of the gangways, which lead from the submarine pool at the temple end of the watery tunnel to the pits of Isis. Many trips were required, but at last all stood safely together again at the beginning of the end of our quest. 5,000 strong we were, all seasoned fighting men of the most warlike race of the red men of Barsoom. As Carthoris alone knew the hidden ways of the tunnels, we could not divide the party and attack the temple at several points at once, as would have been most desirable, and so it was decided that he would lead us all as quickly as possible to a point near the temple's center. As we were about to leave the pool and enter the corridor, an officer called my attention to the waters upon which the submarine floated. At first they seemed to be merely agitated, as from the movement of some great body beneath the surface, and I at once conjectured that another submarine was rising to the surface in pursuit of us. But presently it became apparent that the level of the waters was rising, not with extreme rapidity, but very surely, and that soon they would overflow the sides of the pool and submerge the floor of the chamber. For a moment I did not fully grasp the terrible import of the slowly rising water. It was Carthoris who realized the full meaning of the thing, its cause and the reason for it. "Haste!" he cried. "If we delay, we all are lost. The pumps of Omine have been stopped. They would drown us like rats in a trap. We must reach the upper levels of the pits in advance of the flood, or we shall never reach them. Come!" "Lead the way, Carthoris," I cried. "We will follow." At my command the youth leaped into one of the corridors, and in column of twos the soldiers followed him in good order, each company entering the corridor only at the command of its dwar, or captain. Before the last company filed from the chamber the water was ankle deep, and that the men were nervous was quite evident. Entirely unaccustomed to water except in quantities sufficient for drinking and bathing purposes, the red Martians instinctively shrank from it in such formidable depths and menacing activity. That they were undaunted while it swirled and eddied about their ankles spoke well for their bravery and their discipline. I was the last to leave the chamber of the submarine, and as I followed the rear of the column toward the corridor, I moved through water to my knees. The corridor too was flooded to the same depth, for its floor was on a level with the floor of the chamber from which it led, nor was there any perceptible rise for many yards. The march of the troops through the corridor was as rapid as was consistent with the number of men that moved through so narrow a passage, but it was not ample to permit us to gain appreciably on the pursuing tide. As the level of the passage rose, so too did the waters rise until it soon became apparent to me, who brought up the rear, that they were gaining rapidly upon us. I could understand the reason for this, as with the narrowing expanse of Omine as the waters rode towards the apex of its dome, the rapidity of its rise would increase in inverse ratio to the ever-lessening space to be filled. Long ere the last of the column could hope to reach the upper pits which lie above the danger point, I was convinced that the waters would surge after us in overwhelming volume, and that fully half the expedition would be snuffed out. As I cast about for some means of saving as many as possible of the doomed men, I saw a diverging corridor which seemed to rise at a steep angle at my right. The waters were now swirling about my waist. The men directly before me were quickly becoming panic-stricken. Something must be done at once, or they would rush forward upon their fellows in a mad stampede that would result in trampling down hundreds beneath the flood, and eventually clogging the passage beyond any hope of retreat for those in advance. Raising my voice to its utmost, I shouted my command to the dwarves ahead of me. "Call back the last 25 U-10s," I shouted. "Here seems a way of escape. Turn back and follow me." My orders were obeyed by nearer 30 U-10s, so that some 3,000 men came about and hastened into the teeth of the flood, to reach the corridor up which I directed them. As the first dwarf passed in with his U-10, I cautioned him to listen closely for my commands, and under no circumstances to venture into the open or leave the pits for the temple proper until I should have come up with him, or you know that I died before I could reach you. The officer saluted and left me. The men filed rapidly past me and entered the diverging corridor which I hoped would lead to safety. The water rose breast high. Men stumbled, floundered, and went down. Many I grasped and set upon their feet again, but alone the work was greater than I could cope with. Soldiers were being swept beneath the boiling torrent, never to rise. At length the dwarf of the 10th U-10 took a stand beside me. He was a valorous soldier, Gertus by name, and together we kept the now thoroughly frightened troops in the semblance of order, and rescued many that would have drowned otherwise. Dejor Cantos, son of Cantos Can, and a padwar of the 5th U-10, joined us when his U-10 reached the opening through which the men were fleeing. Thereafter not a man was lost of all the hundreds that remained to pass from the main corridor to the branch. As the last U-10 was filing past us, the waters had risen until they surged about our necks, but we clasped hands and stood our ground until the last men had passed to the comparative safety of the new passageway. Here we found an immediate and steep ascent, so that within 100 yards we had reached a point above the waters. For a few minutes we continued rapidly up the steep grade, which I hoped would soon bring us quickly to the upper pits that led into the temple of Ishus, but I was to meet with a cruel disappointment. Suddenly I heard a cry of "Fire!" far ahead, followed almost at once by cries of terror and the loud commands of dwarves and padwars, who were evidently attempting to direct their men away from some grave danger. At last the report came back to us. "They have fired the pits ahead. We are hemmed in by flames in front and flood behind. Help, John Carter, we are suffocating." And then there swept back upon us at the rear a wave of dense smoke that sent us stumbling and blinded into a choking retreat. There was naught to do other than seek a new avenue of escape. The fire and smoke were to be feared 1,000 times over the water, and so I seized upon the first gallery which led out of and up from the suffocating smoke that was engulfing us. Again I stood to one side while the soldiers hastened through on the new way. Some 2,000 must have passed at a rapid run when the stream ceased, but I was not sure that all had been rescued who had not passed the point of origin of the flames, and so to assure myself that no poor devil was left behind to die a horrible death, unsuccored, I ran quickly up the gallery in the direction of the flames, which I could now see burning with a dull glow far ahead. It was hot and stifling work, but at last I reached a point where the fire lit up the corridor sufficiently for me to see that no soldier of helium lay between me and the conflagration. What was in it or upon the far side I could not know, nor could any man have passed through that seething hell of chemicals and lived to learn. Having satisfied my sense of duty, I turned and ran rapidly back to the corridor through which my men had passed. To my horror, however, I found that my retreat in this direction had been blocked. Across the mouth of the corridor stood a massive steel grating that had evidently been lowered from its resting place above for the purpose of effectually cutting off my escape. That our principal movements were known to the firstborn I could not have doubted, in view of the attack of the fleet upon us the day before. Nor could the stopping of the pumps of Omine at the psychological moment have been due to chance, nor the starting of a chemical combustion within the one corridor through which we were advancing upon the temple of Ishus been due to aught than well-calculated design. And now the dropping of the steel gate to pen me effectually between fire and flood seemed to indicate that invisible eyes were upon us at every moment. What chance had I, then, to rescue Dejah Thoris were I to be compelled to fight foes who never showed themselves? 1,000 times I berated myself for being drawn into such a trap, as I might have known these pits easily could be. Now I saw that it would have been much better to have kept our force intact and made a concerted attack upon the temple from the valley side, trusting to chance and our great fighting ability to have overwhelmed the firstborn and compelled the safe delivery of Dejah-Thoris to me. The smoke from the fire was forcing me further and further back down the corridor toward the waters which I could hear surging through the darkness. With my men had gone the last torch, nor was this corridor lighted by the radiance of phosphorescent rock as were those of the lower levels. It was this fact that assured me that I was not far from the upper pits which lie directly beneath the temple. Finally I felt the lapping waters about my feet. The smoke was thick behind me. My suffering was intense. There seemed but one thing to do, and that to choose the easier death which confronted me. And so I moved on down the corridor until the cold waters of Omine closed about me, and I swam on through utter blackness toward what? The instinct of self-preservation is strong even when one, unafraid and in the possession of his highest reasoning faculties, knows that death, positive and unalterable, lies just ahead. And so I swam slowly on, waiting for my head to touch the top of the corridor, which would mean that I had reached the limit of my flight and the point where I must sink forever to an unmarked grave. But to my surprise I ran against a blank wall before I reached a point where the waters came to the roof of the corridor. Could I be mistaken? I felt around. No, I had come to the main corridor, and still there was breathing space between the surface of the water and the rocky ceiling above. And then I turned up the main corridor in the direction that Carthoris and the head of the column had passed a half-hour before. On and on I swam, my heart growing lighter at every stroke, for I knew that I was approaching closer and closer to the point where there would be no chance that the waters ahead could be deeper than they were about me. I was positive that I must soon feel the solid floor beneath my feet again, and that once more my chance would come to reach the temple of Ishis and the side of the fair prisoner who languished there. But even as hope was at its highest, I felt the sudden shock of contact as my head struck the rocks above. The worst, then, had come to me. I had reached one of those rare places where a Martian tunnel dips suddenly to a lower level. Somewhere beyond I knew that it rose again, but of what value was that to me, since I did not know how great the distance that it maintained a level entirely beneath the surface of the water. There was but a single forlorn hope, and I took it. Filling my lungs with air, I dived beneath the surface and swam through the inky, icy blackness on and on along the submerged gallery. Time and time again I rose with upstretched hand, only to feel the disappointing rocks close above me. Not for much longer would my lungs withstand the strain upon them. I felt that I must soon succumb. Nor was there any retreating now that I had gone this far. I knew positively that I could never endure to retrace my path now to the point from which I had felt the waters close above my head. Death stared me in the face, nor ever can I recall a time that I so distinctly felt the icy breath from his dead lips upon my brow. One more frantic effort I made with my fast-ebbing strength. Weakly I rose for the last time. My tortured lungs gasped for the breath that would fill them with a strange and numbing element. But instead I felt the revivifying breath of life-giving air surge through my starving nostrils into my dying lungs. I was saved. A few more strokes brought me to a point where my feet touched the floor, and soon thereafter I was above the water level entirely, and racing like mad along the corridor, searching for the first doorway that would lead me to Ishis. If I could not have Dejah-Thoris again, I was at least determined to avenge her death, nor would any life satisfy me other than that of the fiend incarnate who was the cause of such immeasurable suffering upon Barsoom. Sooner than I had expected I came to what appeared to me to be a sudden exit into the temple above. It was at the right side of the corridor, which ran on, probably, to other entrances to the pile above. To me one point was as good as another. What knew I where any of them led? And so without waiting to be again discovered and thwarted, I ran quickly up the short, steep incline and pushed open the doorway at its end. The portal swung slowly in, and before it could be slammed against me I sprang into the chamber beyond. Although not yet dawn, the room was brilliantly lighted. Its sole occupant lay prone upon a low couch at the further side, apparently in sleep. From the hangings and sumptuous furniture of the room I judged it to be a living room of some priestess, possibly of Ishis herself. At the thought the blood tingled through my veins. What, indeed, if fortune had been kind enough to place the hideous creature alone and unguarded in my hands? With her as hostage I could force the acquiescence to my every demand. Cautiously I approached the recumbent figure on noiseless feet. Closer and closer I came to it, but I had crossed but little more than half the chamber when the figure stirred, and, as I sprang, rose and faced me. At first an expression of terror overspread the features of the woman who confronted me, then startled, incredulity, hope, thanksgiving. My heart pounded within my breast as I advanced toward her. Tears came to my eyes, and the words that would have poured forth in a perfect torrent choked in my throat as I opened my arms and took into them once more the woman I loved, Dejah-Thoris, Princess of Helium. End of chapter 21.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the South Shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 22. Victory and Defeat. John Carter, she sobbed, with her dear head upon my shoulder. Even now I can scarce believe the witness of my own eyes. When the girl, Thuvia, told me that you had returned to Barsoom, I listened, but I could not understand, for it seemed that such happiness would be impossible for one who had suffered so, in silent loneliness for all these long years. At last, when I realized that it was truth, and then came to know the awful place in which I was held prisoner, I learned to doubt that even you could reach me here. As the days passed, and moon after moon went by without bringing even the faintest rumor of you, I resigned myself to my fate. And now that you have come, scarce can I believe it. For an hour I have heard the sounds of conflict within the palace. I knew not what they meant, but I have hoped against hope that it might be the men of Helium headed by my prince. And tell me, what of Carthoris, our son? He was with me less than an hour since, Dejah-Thoris, I replied. It must have been he whose men you have heard battling within the precincts of the temple. Where's Ishis? I asked suddenly. Dejah-Thoris shrugged her shoulders. She sent me under guard to this room just before the fighting began within the temple halls. She said that she would send for me later. She seemed very angry and somewhat fearful. Never have I seen her act in so uncertain and almost terrified a manner. Now I know that it must have been because she had learned that John Carter, Prince of Helium, was approaching to demand an accounting of her for the imprisonment of his princess. The sounds of conflict, the clash of arms, the shouting and the hurrying of many feet came to us from various parts of the temple. I knew that I was needed there, but I dared not leave Dejah-Thoris, nor dared I take her with me into the turmoil and danger of battle. At last I bethought me of the pits from which I had just emerged. Why not secrete her there until I could return and fetch her away in safety and forever from this awful place? I explained my plan to her. For a moment she clung more closely to me. I cannot bear to be parted from you now, even for a moment, John Carter, she said. I shudder at the thought of being alone again where that terrible creature might discover me. You do not know her. None can imagine her ferocious cruelty who has not witnessed her daily acts for over half a year. It has taken me nearly all this time to realize even the things that I have seen with my own eyes. I shall not leave you then, my princess, I replied. She was silent for a moment, then she drew my face to hers and kissed me. Go, John Carter, she said. Our son is there, and the soldiers of Helium, fighting for the Princess of Helium. Where they are, you should be. I must not think of myself now, but of them and of my husband's duty. I may not stand in the way of that. Hide me in the pits and go. I led her to the door through which I had entered the chamber from below. There I pressed her dear form to me, and then, though it tore my heart to do it, and filled me only with the blackest shadows of terrible foreboding, I guided her across the threshold, kissed her once again, and closed the door upon her. Without hesitating longer, I hurried from the chamber in the direction of the greatest tumult. Scarce half a dozen chambers had I traversed before I came upon the theatre of a fierce struggle. The blacks were massed at the entrance to a great chamber, where they were attempting to block the further progress of a body of red men toward the inner sacred precincts of the temple. Coming from within as I did, I found myself behind the blacks, and, without waiting to even calculate their numbers or the foolhardiness of my venture, I charged swiftly across the chamber and fell upon them from the rear with my keen longsword. As I struck the first blow, I cried aloud, "For Helium!" and then I rained cut after cut upon the surprised warriors, while the Reds without took heart at the sound of my voice, and with shouts of "John Carter! John Carter!" redoubled their efforts so effectually that before the blacks could recover from their temporary demoralization, their ranks were broken and the red men had burst into the chamber. The fight within that room, had it had but a competent chronicler, would go down in the annals of Barsoom as a historic memorial to the grim ferocity of her warlike people. 500 men fought there that day, the black men against the red. No man asked quarter or gave it. As though by common assent they fought, as though to determine once and for all their right to live, in accordance with the law of the survival of the fittest. I think we all knew that upon the outcome of this battle would hinge forever the relative positions of these two races upon Barsoom. It was a battle between the old and the new, but not for once did I question the outcome of it. With Carthoris at my side, I fought for the red men of Barsoom, and for their total emancipation from the throttling bondage of a hideous superstition. Back and forth across the room we surged, until the floor was ankle-deep in blood, and dead men lay so thickly there that half the time we stood upon their bodies as we fought. As we swung toward the great windows which overlooked the gardens of Ishis, a sight met my gaze which sent a wave of exultation over me. "Look!" I cried. "Men of the firstborn, look!" For an instant the fighting ceased, and with one accord every eye turned in the direction I had indicated, and the sight they saw was one no man of the firstborn had ever imagined could be. Across the gardens, from side to side, stood a wavering line of black warriors, while beyond them, and forcing them ever back, was a green horde of green warriors astride their mighty thoats. And as we watched, one, fiercer and more grimly terrible than his fellows, rode forward from the rear, and as he came he shouted some fierce command to his terrible legion. It was Tars Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, and as he couched his great 40-foot metal-shod lance we saw his warriors do likewise. Then it was that we interpreted his command. 20 yards now separated the green men from the black line. Another word from the great Thark, and with a wild and terrifying battle cry the green warriors charged. For a moment the black line held, but only for a moment. Then the fearsome beasts that bore equally terrible riders passed completely through it. After them came Utan upon Utan of red men. The green horde broke to surround the temple. The red men charged for the interior, and then we turned to continue our interrupted battle, but our foes had vanished. My first thought was of Dejah Thoris. Calling to Carthoris that I had found his mother, I started on a run toward the chamber where I had left her with my boy close beside me. After us came those of our little force who had survived the bloody conflict. The moment I entered the room I saw that someone had been there since I had left. A silk lay upon the floor. It had not been there before. There were also a dagger and several metal ornaments strewn about as though torn from their wearer in a struggle. But worst of all, the door leading to the pits where I had hidden my princess was ajar. With a bound I was before it, and thrusting it open, rushed within. Dejah Thoris had vanished. I called her name aloud again and again, but there was no response. I think in that instance I hovered upon the verge of insanity. I do not recall what I said or did, but I know that for an instant I was seized with the rage of a maniac. "Ishis!" I cried. "Ishis! Where is Ishis? Search the temple for her, but let no man harm her but John Carter. Carthoris, where are the apartments of Ishis?" "This way," cried the boy, and without waiting to know that I had heard him, he dashed off at breakneck speed, further into the bowels of the temple. As fast as he went, however, I was still beside him, urging him on to greater speed. At last we came to a great carved door, and through this Carthoris dashed, a foot ahead of me. Within we came upon such a scene as I had witnessed within the temple once before, the throne of Ishis, with the reclining slaves, and about it the ranks of soldiery. We did not even give the men a chance to draw, so quickly were we upon them. With a single cut I struck down 2 in the front rank, and then by the mere weight and momentum of my body I rushed completely through the 2 remaining ranks and sprang upon the dais beside the carved Sorapus throne. The repulsive creature, squatting there in terror, attempted to escape me and leap into a trap behind her, but this time I was not to be outwitted by any such pretty subterfuge. Before she had half arisen I had grasped her by the arm, and then, as I saw the guards starting to make a concerted rush upon me from all sides, I whipped out my dagger, and, holding it close to that vile breast, ordered them to halt. "Back!" I cried to them. "Back!" The first black foot that is planted upon this platform sends my dagger into Ishish's heart. For an instant they hesitated. Then an officer ordered them back, while from the outer corridor there swept into the throne room, at the heels of my little party of survivors, a full 1,000 red men under Cantos Can, Horvastus, and Exodar. "Where's Dejah Thoris?" I cried to the thing within my hands. For a moment her eyes roved wildly about the scene beneath her. I think that it took a moment for the true condition to make any impression upon her. She could not at first realize that the temple had fallen before the assault of men of the outer world. When she did, there must have come to a terrible realization of what it meant to her, the loss of power, humiliation, the exposure of the fraud and imposture which she had for so long played upon her own people. There was just one thing needed to complete the reality of the picture she was seeing, and that was added by the highest noble of her realm, the high priest of her religion, the prime minister of her government. "Isis, goddess of death and of life eternal," he cried, "arise in the might of thy righteous wrath, and with one single wave of thy omnipotent hand strike dead thy blasphemers. Let not one escape. Isis, thy people depend upon thee. Daughter of the lesser moon, thou only art all-powerful. Thou only canst save thy people. I am done. We await thy will. Strike." And then it was that she went mad. A screaming, gibbering maniac writhed in my grasp. It bit and clawed and scratched in impotent fury, and then it laughed a weird, terrible laughter that froze the blood. The slave girls upon the dais shrieked and cowered away, and the thing jumped at them and gnashed its teeth, and then spat upon them from frothing lips. God, but it was a horrid sight. Finally I shook the thing, hoping to recall it for a moment to reality. "Where is Dejah Thoris?" I cried again. The awful creature in my grasp mumbled inarticulately for a moment. Then a sudden gleam of cunning shot into those hideous, close-set eyes. "Dejah Thoris? Dejah Thoris?" Then that shrill, unearthly laugh pierced our ears once more. "Yes, Dejah Thoris I know, and Thuvia, and Feodor, daughter of Matai Shang. They each love John Carter. Ha! But it is drool. Together for a year they will meditate within the temple of the sun, but ere the year is quite gone there will be no more food for them. Ho ho, what divine entertainment!" And she licked the froth from her cruel lips. "There will be no more food except each other. Ha! Ha!" The horror of the suggestion nearly paralyzed me. To this awful fate the creature within my power had condemned my princess. I trembled in the ferocity of my rage. As a terrier shakes a rat, I shook Isis, goddess of life eternal. "Countermand your orders," I cried. "Recall the condemned. Haste, or you die." "It is too late. Ha ha!" And then she commenced her gibbering and shrieking again. Almost of its own volition, my dagger flew up above that putrid heart. But something stayed my hand, and I am now glad that it did. It were a terrible thing to have struck down a woman with one's own hand. But a fitter fate occurred to me for this false deity. "Firstborn," I cried, turning to those who stood within the chamber, "you have seen today the impotency of Isis. The gods are impotent. Isis is no god. She is a cruel and wicked old woman who has deceived and played upon you for ages. Take her. John Carter, Prince of Helium, would not contaminate his hands with her blood." And with that I pushed the raving beast, whom a short half-hour before a whole world had worshipped as divine, from the platform of her throne into the waiting clutches of her betrayed and vengeful people. Spying Exodar among the officers of the Red Men, I called him to lead me quickly to the Temple of the Sun. And, without waiting to learn what fate the firstborn would wreak upon their goddess, I rushed from the chamber with Exodar, Carthoris, Horvastus, Cantos Can, and a score of other red nobles. The black led us rapidly through the inner chambers of the temple, until we stood within the central court, a great circular space paved with a transparent marble of exquisite whiteness. Before us rose a golden temple wrought in the most wondrous and fanciful designs, inlaid with diamond, ruby, sapphire, turquoise, emerald, and the 1,000 nameless gems of Mars, which far transcend in loveliness and purity of ray the most priceless stones of earth. "This way," cried Exodar, leading us toward the entrance to a tunnel which opened in the courtyard beside the temple. Just as we were on the point of descending, we heard a deep-toned roar burst from the temple of Isis, which we had but just quitted, and then a red man, Dajor Cantos, Padwar of the 5th Utan, broke from a nearby gate, crying to us to return. "The blacks have fired the temple," he cried. "In 1,000 places it is burning now. Haste to the outer gardens, or you are lost." As he spoke, we saw smoke pouring from a dozen windows looking out upon the courtyard of the Temple of the Sun, and far above the highest minaret of Isis hung an ever-growing pall of smoke. Go back, I cried to those who had accompanied me. "The way, Exeter, point the way and lead me. I shall reach my princess yet." "Follow me, John Carter," replied Exeter, and without waiting for my reply he dashed down into the tunnel at our feet. At his heels I ran down through a half-dozen tiers of galleries, until at last he led me along a level floor, at the end of which I discerned a lighted chamber. Massive bars blocked our further progress, but beyond I saw her, my incomparable princess, and with her were Thuvia and Feodor. When she saw me she rushed toward the bars that separated us. Already the chamber had turned upon its slow way so far that but a portion of the opening in the temple wall was opposite the barred end of the corridor. Slowly the interval was closing. In a short time there would be but a tiny crack, and then even that would be closed, and for a long Barsoomian year the chamber would slowly revolve until once more for a brief day the aperture in its wall would pass the corridor's end. But in the meantime what horrible things would go on within that chamber? "Exeter," I cried, "can no power stop this awful revolving thing? Is there none who holds the secret of these terrible bars?" "None, I fear, whom we could fetch in time, though I shall go and make the attempt. Wait for me here." After he had left, I stood and talked with Dejah Thoris, and she stretched her dear hand through those cruel bars that I might hold it until the last moment. Thuvia and Feodor came close also, but when Thuvia saw that we would be alone, she withdrew to the further side of the chamber. Not so the daughter of Matai Shang. "John Carter," she said, "this be the last time that you shall see any of us. Tell me that you love me, that I may die happy." "I love only the Princess of Helium," I replied quietly. "I am sorry, Feodor, but it is as I have told you from the beginning." She bit her lip and turned away, but not before I saw the black and ugly scowl she turned upon Dejah Thoris. Thereafter she stood a little way apart, but not so far as I should have desired, for I had many little confidences to impart to my long-lost love. For a few minutes we stood thus talking in low tones. Ever smaller and smaller grew the opening. In a short time now it would be too small even to permit the slender form of my princess to pass. Oh, why did not Exeter haste? Above we could hear the faint echoes of a great tumult. It was the multitude of black and red and green men fighting their way through the fire from the burning temple of Isis. A draught from above brought the fumes of smoke to our nostrils. As we stood waiting for Exeter, the smoke became thicker and thicker. Presently we heard shouting at the far end of the corridor and hurrying feet. "Come back, John Carter, come back," cried a voice. "Even the pits are burning." In a moment a dozen men broke through the now blinding smoke to my side. There was Carthoris and Cantos Can and Horvastus and Exeter, with a few more who had followed me to the temple court. "There is no hope, John Carter," cried Exeter. "The keeper of the keys is dead, and his keys are not upon his carcass. Our only hope is to quench this conflagration and trust to fate that a year will find your princess alive and well. I have brought sufficient food to last them. When this crack closes no smoke can reach them, and if we hasten to extinguish the flames, I believe they will be safe." "Go then yourself and take these others with you," I replied. "I shall remain here beside my princess until a merciful death releases me from my anguish. I care not to live." As I spoke, Exeter had been tossing a great number of tiny cans within the prison cell. The remaining crack was not over an inch in width a moment later. Dejah Thoris stood as close to it as she could, whispering words of hope and courage to me, and urging me to save myself. Suddenly, beyond her, I saw the beautiful face of Feodor contorted into an expression of maligned hatred. As my eyes met hers, she spoke. "Think not, John Carter, that you may so lightly cast aside the love of Feodor, daughter of Mata Shang, nor ever hope to hold thy Dejah Thoris in thy arms again. Wait you the long, long year, but know that when the waiting is over, it shall be Feodor's arms which shall welcome you, not those of the Princess of Helium. Behold, she dies." And as she finished speaking, I saw her raise a dagger on high, and then I saw another figure. It was Thuvia's. As the dagger fell toward the unprotected breast of my love, Thuvia was almost between them. A blinding gust of smoke blotted out the tragedy within that fearsome cell. A shriek rang out, a single shriek as the dagger fell. The smoke cleared away, but we stood gazing upon a blank wall. The last crevice had closed, and for a long year that hideous chamber would retain its secret from the eyes of men. They urged me to leave. "In a moment it will be too late," cried Edgar. "There is, in fact, but a bare chance that we can come through to the outer gate alive even now. I have ordered the pumps started, and in 5 minutes the pits will be flooded. If we would not drown like rats in a trap, we must hasten above and make a dash for safety through the burning temple." "Go," I urged them. "Let me die here beside my princess. There is no hope or happiness elsewhere for me. When they carry her dear body from that terrible place a year hence, let them find the body of her lord awaiting her." Of what happened after that I have only a confused recollection. It seems as though I struggled with many men, and then that I was picked up bodily from the ground and borne away. I do not know. I have never asked, nor has any other who was there that day intruded on my sorrow, or recalled to my mind the occurrences which they know could but at best reopen the terrible wound within my heart. Ah, if I could but know one thing, what a burden of suspense would be lifted from my shoulders! But whether the assassin's dagger reached one fair bosom or another, only time will divulge. End of chapter 22, and end of Gods of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs.